Hi and welcome to our session 7698, Installing and Configuring Windows 10. My name is Alfred Ojukwu. I am a technical solutions professional.
And I'm Joe Lurie. I'm also a technical solutions professional.
Yep.
I'm based out of the Boston area. Alfred?
And I'm out of the New York, New Jersey region. And we want to thank you for joining us today. Today we want to walk through just the exam preparation for 7698 and the solutions around it. But before we go into that, we want to give you a little bit of insight about who we are and what we do. So Joe, I'll let you kind of dig into this first.
Yep, thanks, Alfred. Again, I'm from the Boston area. I don't know if you can tell from my accent. Definitely throughout the series, you'll know, oh, he's definitely from Boston. I am a technology solutions professional. Again, I work for the modern workplace. That means I'm basically today's workplace where we want you to have Windows 10 and Office 365 and EMS. I'm a Windows 10 specialist. I've been with Microsoft about 5 years-ish. And I've been in my role now for about 5 months. Before that, I was with consulting with Microsoft as an MCS consultant, doing everything from Windows XP to 7, 7 to 10, doing SCCM upgrades as well. I also speak at a lot of internal events like Tech Ready and external events like Ignite. And a little fact about myself, which call it a fun fact. I think it's fun. You may not think so. I have never seen a single Star Trek episode, whether it's a TV show of any flavor. I can't even name the different Star Trek series, and I've never seen a movie. I can name like 2 characters on Star Trek, and they're just the common ones. And that's all.
Yeah, I think I'm going to try to sneak in a Star Trek episode on the movies.
Not a chance. Not
just have them watching like, what is this? Oh, it's Star Trek.
Oh, I love this. I went all my life without ever watching one of these. All the time I lost. I love this. Not a chance.
Worth a try. My name is Alfred Ojukwu. Again, I'm a TSP, or a Technical Solutions Professional. Very similar to Joe, I work in the modern workplace, but my role is slightly different because I focus mostly on mobile devices. I've had a history of working in consulting over the last 6 to 7 years, and in the industry, as an architect, working in solutions around Windows 7, Windows XP, Windows 10, and deploying it in the infrastructure. So I'm also a certified trainer, just like Joe. I spent quite a bit of years in IT administration. I am also involved in a lot of internal community building programs, as well as external programs that drive readiness from urban league programs and help people sort of get on board with understanding how Microsoft technologies work. An interesting fact about me, again, I grew up in Hawaii. That is, I may not have a hula skirt or anything fun like that.
But we're behind the desk. Trust me, he's got a hula skirt.
Definitely had a lot of fun, growing up. And I actually enjoy a lot of running, a lot of exercise, and really enjoy just traveling to really cool and awesome places. And, definitely here to give you guys information. We have information about us. If you need to get in contact with us, our emails are there. And for the agenda today, what we want to be able to do is cover 3 different sections, but we're going to do it in a very unique way. We're going to break it up into a number of different sections, but these modules, implementing Windows, configuring support core services, and manage and maintain Windows, are the 3 sections that are available in the 7698 exam. So although you're looking at this from a 3-module session, we're going to be covering it in about 6 different modules.
6 or 7 modules. Yeah, we broke it down because if we left them all as module 1, module 2, module 3, you'd be listening to us for 2 hours straight without a break. So instead, you get a lot of chunks of 25 or so minute videos of us.
So this is really our chance to kind of prepare you for the exam. So again, for this exam, the expectation is that you've had a chance to sort of familiarize yourself with Windows 10. You have access to some level of virtual labs. You understand how to deploy Windows 10, manage Windows 10, and also take advantage of the solutions around Windows 10.
And one thing I'm going to mention a lot during the series, I'm going to mention it right now as well, is things are moving very fast here in Redmond, and things are moving very fast in Microsoft Learning. So what happens is about every 6 months or so, as new feature releases come out with Windows 10, the exams do get eventually upgraded to remove deprecated features and to add the new features. It doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen as soon as the new updates come out. So keep an eye on the Microsoft Learning page for 70-698. Keep an eye on TechNet so you know what the new features are, and know when the last update of the exam happened. That'll be listed there on the 70-698 Microsoft Learning page.
So throughout these modules and throughout these sections, we're really hoping that you can stay with us as we go through the content. We've done it. We're going to do our best to make sure that we break it down as much as possible. And our challenge to you is find the sections that don't make sense to you. Focus on those, pull up the books, read the documents, and make sure that you fill yourself with that knowledge before you actually have to go into the exam room. And once again, thanks for joining us, and hope you enjoy the session. And welcome back. We're going to be covering today in the sections implementing Windows as part of the configuring Windows 10 solution. So in this section, we really are diving into understanding how to implement Windows. And if we were to take a look at sort of what's required when we're implementing Windows, this section really covers the installation requirements. Things like determining the hardware that you need to have, choosing between whether you're going to do a clean install versus an upgrade process, and then also talking about a number of different requirements that are within the actual platform, whether you're going to use Cortana, Miracast, and a number of other solutions.
Right, and a lot of this has to do with which version of Windows you'll be installing. We'll get to that video in a little while as well. And the installation requirements, as you said, with hardware, if you'll be using Hyper-V as an example, you may need different processor, different hardware than if you're not using Hyper-V.
Exactly.
So it all ties in together.
So as we go into it, the first section we want to think about is the hardware requirements. Now, Windows 10 really is probably the best and most utilized operating system, hopefully soon, that we can have available. The important thing to remember about Windows 10 is that it still has its specs, its requirements, and we've kept it at a minimum, just like we've done with the other operating systems. The important things that we've listed out here are things to remember for the exam. For example, the processor requirements at a minimum is a 1 gigahertz or faster processor that you need to have running, as well as a 1 gigabyte memory or RAM.
And again, there's things that we don't list there with the processor. If you're using Hyper-V, you need to make sure it's a virtualization-enabled processor, and things like that you want to consider as well. But yeah, the RAM, 1 gig or 2 gig if it's 64-bit Windows, and the hard disk space, make sure you have enough hard disk space. And again, if you're using Hyper-V, and I'll keep going back to that, you may need more disk space to host those VMs.
We also mentioned the use of DirectX 9 for later versions of display drivers. So make sure that you're also running using that, the WDDM as well. That's also a requirement. And lastly, just having a display resolution of about 806 by 600. So if you have a device that you're looking to test out or install Windows 10, those are some of the prerequisites. In other words, if you were to install it on anything less, or if they ask you questions about installing it on anything less, it will be a less than optimal experience. So from a support standpoint, that's what we look for.
Right, exactly.
The other things to be aware of is just the hardware compatibilities. Now, Microsoft has a tool called the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. Now, the importance of this tool is it basically allows you to do some level of analysis or discovery within your organization in terms of whether or not you are ready to upgrade to Windows 10. So it does things like discovering the versions of Internet Explorer that's running, whether you're running the number of Windows 10 machines out there, if they're running specific software or hardware that that
applications, the versions, the ISV of the vendor. Yeah, we know that they're running Adobe, but which version of Adobe Reader are they running, and is that compatible? So the Map Toolkit actually allows you to schedule the scans. It's agentless. You push it out. You push the query from the server, and it just uses a WMI on all the workstations, reports back. So that's, again, the Map Toolkit. It's free to download at Microsoft.com.
Yeah, and it really is just there to determine your readiness to move to Windows 10. So from a hardware compatibility standpoint, and if you get any questions around the Map Toolkit or readiness, that's one of the things you want to consider. Understand the difference between what the Map Toolkit provides, and Joe, what the upgrade analysis
upgrade readiness. So they actually, that's actually a good time to bring this up. Things are moving very fast in Redmond, right? Windows 10 is updating a lot. And one of the things that we've updated is the name of our upgrade readiness. So it used to be called Upgrade Analytics, and now it's Upgrade Readiness. And that's an online, it's hosted in Azure, but it doesn't use your own Azure tenant. So it's kind of free. And we say free like a puppy is free. The puppy is free, but you still have to go to the vet, you still have to get it shot, still have to get it at home, and all that stuff.
Well, so it's not really free. But
the puppy is free, right? So in this case, Upgrade Analytics, Upgrade Readiness is free. But what's not free is it's hosted as part of the OMS, or Operations Management Suite subscription. That's a subscription-based, and it's hosted up in Azure. So what that does is that does have an agent on the client machines, and you schedule scans on that as well, and it and it pushes it up to the cloud. Now, the nice thing about that is we have data from hundreds of millions of machines running Windows 10 already and running some of this software, so we know if it's compatible. And we also have data from the ISVs. So the Semantics and Adobe's and Oracle's, they come to us and say, yes, this is supported on Windows 10 version 1607, version 1703, et cetera. So we have all that hosted up there in the OMS subscriptions as well.
So I remember there used to be a tool called the Application Compatibility Toolkit. Now, if I'm in the exam and I get a question around MAP Toolkit, the Application Compatibility Toolkit, and the upgrade readiness, as you just mentioned, like how do I make a decision?
Right, so that's a good question, and they are different, right? Application Compatibility Toolkit allows you to create shims or fixes to applications that aren't compatible, and they're not compatible for one reason or another. It could be a user account control compatibility issue or some other kind of coding issue, and and so that allows you to create a shim and then put that in there. What the upgrade readiness does, it doesn't create any shims. What it does, it just lets you know what's compatible and what's not compatible. Allow you to say, okay, I have this grouping of computers that everything works on Windows 10. That's my low-hanging fruit. Let's push out the upgrades to those machines right now.
Excellent. So you still have three options when you're talking about deployments, and we wanted to make sure you understand what those options are as we go through this module with you. They have three options that we talk about is wipe and load, which is basically just starting from a new machine and just wiping it and starting with a new build. There's the in-place upgrade, which we'll also go over, and there's also provisioning. Now we've listed them out just high level here so you understand that there are those three options, but you have to make those decisions way early in the deployment of Windows 10.
Oh, absolutely. So, for example, a wipe and load versus in-place upgrade versus provisioning will determine whether or not you have to go to your OEM and say, hey, I need to order 1,000 machines or 10,000 machines.
So the first option is we have listed here is the wipe and load feature, which is basically, it's what enterprises are typically used to. It's basically out-of-box support for Windows 7 or Windows 8, Windows 8.1. You can just basically take a system, wipe it, start with a process of using some sort of user state migration tool, and reload it with a new image.
Right, very common scenario on the exam. Why would I do a wipe and load? Because you're going to see in the next slide, we're going to tout the in-place upgrade. So why would I do a wipe and load? I would do a wipe and load for the exam if I'm going from Windows 7 x86 to Windows 10 x64. There's no in-place upgrade for that. So that would have to be a wipe and load. Or you just have a lot of old user profiles and a lot of old applications, and it just might be easier to start with a wipe and load. But typically for an exam purpose, you're going to go from x86 to x64, and that's why you're doing the wipe and load. Now, I said a little bit earlier, things are moving very fast in Redmond, and a lot of things are changing. So you're going to want to keep up with the technology of Windows 10 and with the exam specs, right? So as of the recording of this, anniversary update version 1607 is the current Branch for Business version of Windows 10 that's out. Coming up very soon is version 1703 that we're calling Creators Update. Creators Update has a way to do a legacy BIOS to the UFI with the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface BIOS, so that the newfangled BIOS with all the new security features, it can do that during an in-place upgrade. Currently, right now, as we're recording this, that's not available. So a wipe and load might be to do a BIOS to UFI conversion, but in future versions of Windows, you can do that with an in-place upgrade.
So for the exam, as you're preparing for scenarios like this, think about the challenges that you have in the enterprise when you're looking to do this upgrade and dealing with just the BIOS, the upgrade process, whether or not you're running on a BIOS system that needs to be converted to UEFI. This might be one of those questions where you have to understand that starting fresh with new machines might be the best option versus having to do just a basic upgrade process.
Or a wipe and load with an existing machine.
Exactly.
Right? Yep.
The tools to remember about this is that if you're doing a wipe and load, you're going to still need to use MDT, Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, which we'll talk about later, as well as SCCM, which is the much more automated process and requires the enterprise software deployment tool to actually push out the actual update or migration of that system itself. The other area that we mentioned is the in-place upgrade, which is if I have a Windows 10 machine and it's running, if I have a Windows 7 machine or Windows 8 or 8.1 machine, I can actually look to upgrade that machine without having to do a complete wipe. What that means is my data stays intact, my personal files stay intact, And everything stays intact while it basically removes the existing operating system and updates it with the new operating system.
Everything stays exactly where it was on the hard drive. And if you're using SCCM and you've used BitLocker as your disk encryption, BitLocker will pause itself before the in-place upgrades. That's also nice. Also, for the exam purposes, a lot of us have had a lot of experience, multiple years experience with operating system upgrades. And so we, in our back of our minds, might have a bad muscle memory about operating system in-place upgrades because we've tried it from 2000 to XP or XP to 7 or Vista somewhere in between or 7 to 8 and didn't like the in-place upgrade process. So what we would end up doing is, on the exam, would say, well, I'm not doing an in-place upgrade because I wouldn't do an in-place upgrade. In Windows 10, we've made it a seamless process, and we've rewritten the way it works. And I say to a lot of my customers, we have proven that this in-place upgrade works because back in July 2015, we pushed out the upgrade to hundreds of millions of home users. And they all took it as an in-place upgrade, nearly 100% success. So the in-place upgrade does actually work better than it did in previous versions.
And the simplest thing to remember about the in-place upgrade, it might be just a simple command on the operating system. If you run setup.exe/auto upgrade, you can actually upgrade to the latest version as long as you have the actual binaries for the Windows 10 image. And again, that can be automated through, SCCM as well as part of the process. The third option you have is, let's just say you are a device provider, and you decide that you want your employees to basically purchase their device and then image it so that it meets the corporate standards. So provisioning, which isn't re-imaging, provisioning allows you to take a standard business device that's running whatever SKU you want. Let's just say Windows 10, it's running, a Pro or Enterprise, and provision it based on the provisioning packages so that you can basically have it install configurations on the OS that matches your organizational requirements.
Basically, the way it works is this. You say to your users, and we call this a choose your own device, or CYOD scenario. You say to your users, I want you to go to your favorite big box retail store and buy yourself a Windows 10 professional machine. Windows 10, doesn't matter as long as it's not home edition, Windows 10 professional machine. And when you first start it up, you're going to get to what we call UBI, or out-of-box experience. At that point, it's going to ask you for a provisioning package. Plug this USB into that device and point to the provisioning package. What will happen at that point, and we'll show you in a few minutes how you would create that provisioning package, but what would happen is the SKU would change to your enterprise key, it would change to your corporate volume license key, it would change to an enterprise SKU, and maybe enroll in an Intune or an MDM solution, a mobile device management solution, possibly install applications after that. So the provisioning package is a very quick way to go to your favorite retail store, buy a Windows 10 professional machine, and then have it being managed by your company in under 30 minutes.
Right, and the simplicity of it is creating a provisioning package requires you to use the Windows Configuration Designer. And in the slide here, we kind of have a quick show of what that Windows Configuration Designer looks like. Here's where you'd install it using the Assessment and Deployment Kit. And once you have that installed, once you open it up, you can actually create a new project. In that process of creating a new project, you're basically going to decide that you're going to image or add specific drivers that are exclusive to that device that you're actually provisioning. And if we selected a certain set of drivers, we can actually do things like upgrade the production key, add additional components to that provisioning package. And all it is a bunch of settings that are going to be applied to your machine regardless of how it gets applied. It basically then takes on that persona for that machine itself.
And just another little interesting tidbit about this, because we keep talking about, or I keep talking about how fast things are moving. Right before we came out to record this video series, this was called the Windows Imaging Configuration Designer. So it was WICD, W-I-C-D, from being from Boston. I use the word wicked all the time.
Now it's really wicked.
So this was WICD. But they've decided in Redmond that very few people, and we know this from our telemetry, very few people are actually using the imaging portion of it, like under 2% that use Wicked actually use the imaging, so they removed that capability. And so you'll see in the screen grab that we showed you that it still said Windows Imaging Configuration Designer, because it was literally a couple of weeks before we came out here to do this that they changed it to Windows Configuration Designer. You'll actually notice the executable is still called the either icd.exe or wicd.exe. The I is still in the executable name, but it's not in the tool name any longer.
And that's important to remember because when you're in the exam room, you might see WICD, you might see WCD.
Exactly. You'd
right?
be like, what's WCD or what's WICD? It's the same tool right now.
Exactly. So you define the file itself, and at that point, that becomes an image or a package that you can basically distribute or provide to your end user so that they can actually plug it in via USB, run the package installation, and it actually configures the device as if it's being provisioned brand new. You can also do this with Windows 10 mobile devices as well, just to use that as a provisioning process and use that to do things like MDM joins and other things of that nature. So that's the third option. So we've mentioned those three.
And again, those, just as a reminder, those were the wipe and load, the in-place upgrade. Again, in-place upgrade, the beneficial is if you're going from x64 to x64. So Windows 7 x64 or Windows 8 8.1 x64 to Windows 10 x64. Do an in-place upgrade whenever possible.
Right. So for this portion of the exam, think about those three options. Now, that doesn't mean that that's all. Those are the only three options you have. They're tools that you have to have inside of those three options. One of the other tools that we'll want to mention is the Windows System and Image Manager, or WSIM. Never know how to say it correctly, but WSIM. You can actually create ANSI files or answer files that are the same set of configurations that you're expecting to install using the out-of-box experience or the UBI experience when you're actually imaging your device. So it works with MDZ 2013 as well, and you can actually provide it as part of the Windows Deployment Services, which is another tool that you can use to deploy images, and you can actually add it to a USB as well.
Yep, if you add this to a USB, let's say you're doing just a local install of Windows 10 on your Windows 7 machine, you can just put this unattended answer file on the USB stick, and SEP will automatically look for all drive letters, look for an auto unattend .xml, and automatically run it.
Okay, and then we talked about upgrades. And Joe, you want to mention?
Yeah, this is you see a lot of checkboxes and a lot of Ds and a lot of this. There's so many versions of Windows, from Windows 7, Windows 8, 8.1, Windows 10, and then minor additions inside of each one of those that I could spend an hour talking about what's supported as an upgrade. What you should know is it is supported to go from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Pro, but Windows 8 Pro to Windows 10 Enterprise. Know those upgrade paths. You see a couple of Ds in there. You can use what's called a downgrade right to go from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Home if you wanted to with a downgrade right. But the exam's not going to test you on downgrade, but I did want to put that in there because it is a possibility. So again, know some of the common ones. The common ones will be Windows 7 Pro or Windows 8 8.1 Pro. Where can you go to Windows 10 as doing even as an in-place upgrade?
So I can go from Windows 7 Pro, if I have one today, come in with the Windows 7 Pro machine, and I want to get to whatever my corporate environment has. I can go from Windows 10 Pro, Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Enterprise.
You can go from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Pro. But again, let's talk about what's happening in the later versions of Windows. You can now actually, throughout this upgrade, you'll go from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Pro, change the license key, it automatically turns into an enterprise. So the upgrade will get you to Windows 10 Pro. Later on, another step in that upgrade might be to change the key to an enterprise key. But if you have Windows 8.1 Pro, that you can upgrade to Windows 10 Enterprise just as part of an in-place upgrade.
Okay, so it's Windows 8.1. So for the exam, just make sure you know the difference between when they're asking about Windows 7 Pro and Windows 8.1 Pro, which can actually go to Windows 10 Enterprise as well.
Yep, and again, that nice feature of Windows 10 Pro to Windows 10 Enterprise, change the key, don't even reboot. Literally, you don't have to reboot. You have to in earlier versions of Windows 10, but later versions, you do not need to reboot to switch from Pro to Enterprise.
Okay, so we talk also about USMT, User State Migration Tool. Again, another tool that you can use to take the user data, back it up in a specific location, and then do the upgrade, and then replace that user data back into the system itself, whether it be files, user profile information, documents, anything that you want to save or back up as part of the migration status. So USMT itself it also supports the Windows 10, it actually still uses the scan state, load state, as well as the migration XML files. So for the exam, make sure you know the difference between MIG docs, MIG apps, and MIG users. They will be testing you on those the knowledge of those three things. The other thing to keep in mind is, just that USMT also doesn't support, USMT 10 doesn't support earlier versions. So when you're working with Windows 10 or anything later, it's really there for migrating Windows 10 to Windows 10.
Yep, that's a good point. If you're going from Windows 7 to Windows 10, the scan state part of this that's running on the Windows 7 machine, we might have a slide coming up on this. The scan state part running on the Windows 7 machine has to use a version of USMT that's compatible with Windows 7, while the load state portion running on the Windows 10 machine runs the USMT for Windows 10.
Yeah, and this is because these two operating systems are built separately. They don't have the same, relative paths that you would have on each system. So each tool will account for the specific operating system, but in the end, you have to combine those tool sets of tools to make sure that you get the data back where you need it to.
For the exam, what you really need to know is, you need to know a couple of things. You need to know, as Alfred said, the MIG docs and MIG apps and MIG user XML files. You also need to know the difference between scan state and load state, which one is run when, and the whole order of operations. So the next slide we have coming up shows you that order of operations, right?
Yep, and so if we walk you through that process, if, for example, an admin launches the scan state tool.
And this could be an admin launching it if it's doing a manual upgrade for one machine. It also could be just the order that your task sequence is in SECM as an example, right? Scan state runs first.
Right, and then the scan state reads that XML file and basically knows exactly what it needs to back up. And then what it does is it takes that information and collects the data and stores in a specific location so that it can actually be retrieved at whatever time you decide to do the load state. So at this point you have a stored location where you have a set of files that are supposed to be restored on the device itself. And
actually it's an encrypted file.
Exactly.
So no one actually has access to it. No one can open it up on the share or wherever you happen to load it to.
Yep, and then from there, once you've done all that work, you've upgraded the system, you've wiped the device, and now you're running Windows 10, you might want to take the load state for Windows 10 on the USMT side and start that same process again. So it then says, hey, I need to initiate a load state. So you run that the command. It then goes and looks at that specific XML file. It says, these are the files that I need to restore back on that device. And from there, it says, okay, let me grab those files for you, use load state, and restore it on that device as a destination location. Now, the good thing about this, having it on a separate storage location in the USMT process, is that if for some reason you don't get the information back that you need, you can always go back and find it in that stored location.
And the other piece of that is if it's not stored in a network location and you're doing even a wipe and load from Windows 7 to Windows 10, you can have what we call hard links with USMT.
Yes.
So when the disk gets wiped in that wipe and load, these USMT marks these specific sectors, these specific files as don't wipe. Right, so you don't need any network access for this. You just do the hard link, scan it, hard link it, install the operating system, install the applications, and then load state looks for those hard links to restore all the data.
Yeah, and a little tidbit from many of you guys. If you think about what the in-place upgrade is doing, that is essentially how it's able to accomplish just that process of doing the in-place upgrade, because it uses the internal links to save the documents in a specific location and then restores it back when it's complete.
So this next slide we have, as we just said, there's different versions of USMT based on the operating system you're coming from and going to. So you can just see we put here, if you're coming from Windows XP, I should also note while that's on there, there's no in-place upgrade path from Windows XP. You'd have to go XP to 7, then 7 to 10. If you want to do it as an in-place upgrade, probably you'll do a wipe and load instead. That said, you'd have to use a really old version of USMT to get the scan state on the Windows XP machine.
If you want your data back, that is.
Same thing with Vista. There's no actual path to upgrade without going to Windows 7 or 8 or 8.1 first. Anyway, so you can see the versions available for those operating systems. Just make a mental note of that, just so you're aware. The main point here is that scan state for Windows 10 will not work on Windows 7.
And that's important to note. What Joe just mentioned is the fact that there are certain scenarios where you'll have to go from Windows XP to Windows 7 first, and then from Windows 7 to the next version update, or going from Windows 7 to Windows 8 or 8.1 and then moving to Windows 10. So just keep that in mind during the exam so that you know exactly what scenario they're looking for and what you're trying to accomplish by doing it.
Right.
The last slide was I have a practice question for you guys, and I'll go ahead and read that now. Your company's desktop runs 32-bit Windows 7 with Service Pack 1. You're planning the migration to 64-bit Windows 10. You've confirmed that all of the hardware is compatible with 64-bit Windows 10. The migration must meet the following requirements. User settings and files must be preserved during the migration. Existing hardware should be used. What's the best path for this migration?
You know, it's interesting that it's worded that way. What's the best path? Because you can always do a wipe and load. As long as you're using USMT, you can always do a wipe and load. So that's always an option for you.
What's the downside of wipe and load?
The downside of wipe and load is there's the possibility that you could lose data. In this case, you're going from 32-bit to 64 bits. That is really the only option between A and C, right? You can't do an in-place upgrade for that. So what you want to take a look at is, what's the bitness of the first operating system of the second one, and then you want to take a look at the other provisioning package. Provisioning package, we said you're not re-imaging anything in that case. You're going to a big box store and buying your own computer and then making it work with your company. In a side-by-side migration, that's definitely not the best path for anything. That's basically you get two machines for a little while. That's not any kind of migration. So the answer here is a wipe and load migration.
Wipe and load. So there you go, folks. I mean, the important thing to remember is when you're dealing with, just the preparing for going to Windows 10, think about things like what operating system I'm going with, what challenges I have moving from the existing platform to the newer platform, and whether or not I need to use specific tools like the USMT, the application compatibility toolkit, or any of those wiki tools that we've talked about. They're all there for you, and these are things you're going to be challenged on initially. So that kind of completes the first section, so hopefully you stay with us as we continue on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
And welcome back. We're going to be covering Windows additions and features that are available in Windows 10. We'll sort of take you through some of those scenarios in which you get to see what exactly is in each feature as you're doing the installation. And the first slide we have covers Windows 10 additions, a number of different scenarios in which you'd want to actually deploy Windows 10. You have to consider what edition you're running, why you're running that edition, and what technologies are present in that edition.
Exactly. And so, for example, with the Windows 10 Home Edition, that's what most of us will use at home. There's not going to be a lot of companies that use Home Edition. But with Windows 10 Pro, you can get Windows 10 Pro at your big box store. You can get it at your retail store. You can even get it from your OEM. So for the exam, when they say, this is the hardware or you're going to use your OEM to purchase your devices, basically they're going to want to know, should you purchase Pro for education, Enterprise, education, right? It's all these different versions.
And ironically, what happens, you have to remember that many people are starting off running Windows 7 Pro. And so logically, the next step that they think about is, I need to go from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Pro. But in the enterprise, when we're talking about taking advantage of the latest enterprise features, the most logical way to go is from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Enterprise. So again, thinking about a move from the current version to the latest one, always focus on Windows 10 Enterprise as part of your solution.
Right, I tell all my customers the same thing. Yes, you may be using Windows 7 Pro right now, but you should be using Windows 10 Enterprise when you go to Windows 10. And we actually have a slide to show you some of those differences and the security features that you'll gain by going to Windows 10 Enterprise Edition.
Exactly. Windows 10 Mobile is another format that form factor that you'd want to consider. Windows 10 Mobile is typically for mobile devices that are going to be, traveling with you. If you have a 950, a 950 XL, those all run Windows 10 Mobile. Those are additions as well. They are just as much as an operating system as a full desktop or tablet.
And today, they're actually trying to make those the same edition, right? So I mentioned in the last video series that currently right now, Anniversary Update's the live version, the CBB version. We'll talk about CBB in just a few moments. But 1703 Creators Update's coming out really soon. My 950 XL is already updated to Creators Update as part of the Insider program.
So one thing to think about the exam is when they start talking about the LTSB, the long-term servicing branch, the thing to remember is there's certain things that aren't available in there. Even though they're running Windows 10, you don't get it to take advantage of things like Microsoft Edge, Cortana, for example.
Most store apps are not available in LTSB version. It's long-term servicing branch. And the idea there is you have a company that has ATM machines, or they have, it's working to manage one machine in the operating room or on the warehouse floor. So you have a machine that can't be shut down every, doing updates all the time. It can't be getting new versions of Windows every 6 months. So that's long-term servicing branch. It's meant for specialized systems. And by specialized systems, we mean they don't even have Office installed. There are some apps that you will get. You'll get like the settings app because you need that. It's taking place with the control panel. But you don't get, as Alfred said, you don't get Cortana, you don't get Edge. You also don't get Calculator. You get a basic calculator that mimics Windows 95's calculator, but you don't get the nice, cool Windows 10 calculator.
Exactly. So some of those features are missing in Windows 10 LTSB, so know when to make a decision between just going with Windows 10 Enterprise and Windows 10 LTSB. Now, also things to remember is that you have to decide on the bitness, or the bit version. So if you're going with 32-bit Windows 10 or 64-bit version, what are you looking for? Are you looking for memory? Are you looking for performance? So those are the other considerations that you want to think about as you're moving to the Windows 10 platform.
And just a last thing to consider is the hardware that it's sitting on. Because in this case, like I'm using a Surface Pro 4, and we also have a Surface Book device. Neither one of these will support LTSB versions. They only support Enterprise as a current branch of business version.
An example of this other scenario, we talked about the bitness. You might be in a company, or they might give you a scenario of a company that's running specific applications. A 16-bit application that it typically would have worked on a 32-bit system will not work on a 64-bit OS. So at some point, you'll have to consider whether or not you're going to upgrade that application to be much more relevant to what we have today, or you're going to just go with Windows 32, the 32-bit version of Windows 10.
But if you have a 16-bit application, I'm hoping you choose the earlier option to upgrade that at some point.
Exactly. So anyway, so those are some of those options you want to think about. We want to make sure that you understood what those are. Now let's talk a little bit more around the general features that are available in the Windows 10, both the current branch and the current branch for business. So we've listed out some of those scenarios here, starting with Cortana, which is the Windows 10 digital assistant.
Yep, it's our digital assistant. You can see the little screenshot on the right-hand side. It can tell you everything from the weather to your upcoming meetings, if you have conflicts. If you have in your location of a meeting where it is, it'll even tell you how much, based on right now's traffic, how long it's going to take you to get there, and maybe you should leave now. So Cortana has a lot of benefits even to the enterprise versions of Windows. And of course, Edge is our most secure web browser that we've ever produced. Recent tests from third-party companies have shown that it even has better battery life than some of the competing browsers, and it's more secure than the competing browsers. Continuum as one of the features, same experience across your devices.
Well, I really like Continuum, mainly because if you have a Windows 10 mobile device and you have the right connectors, once you plug in that mobile device to a monitor or screen, it literally takes that Windows 10 operating system and projects it into that screen, and you can use it as a full desktop. Right? It becomes sort of a full experience. So Continuum is also one of those ways of expanding and allowing you to use smaller devices within the office and then take that same device and have the data also available remotely.
Mm-hmm. Miracast as the next one. I wish what we had here behind us, instead of having this beautiful Seattle skyline, I wish we had a Surface Hub. And the reason why I wish we had a Surface Hub, first of all, they're really cool. If you haven't used a Surface Hub, go to a retail store and look at a Surface Hub. But also because I want to talk about Miracast. And what you can do with Miracast is you go into a presentation and you bring your Windows 10 device to the presentation room. You can just Control-P, connect to a wireless display. You don't need to plug anything in. It's all wireless. And you can connect right up to that Surface Hub or whatever your display is that supports Miracast, and you can present your entire PowerPoint deck without ever plugging a single thing in. So that's Miracast. It's really nice feature.
So the other big feature that we see in Windows 10 is the touch, the ability to actually use the actual screen to input information. So both with the pen, and I have an example here of a pen where you can actually use that to do the inputting of information. If I wanted to change information on here, I can actually just circle it around, and I can actually erase information as well if I wanted to get things off the screen. The touch, the input is also an experience that we see with Windows 10. And another reason why a lot of employees are moving towards Windows 10 as a platform. They get to take advantage of those features.
It's really nice. I was in a meeting with my customer last week, and they wanted to see an example of inking. And I said, this meeting is giving us an example of inking. You have your employee using OneNote and typing her notes, and I have my salesperson with me using OneNote and handwriting his notes in OneNote. And so I said, we already see an example of that here between typing in notes or handwriting in notes.
Exactly. And then OneDrive as well is a free online storage. You can have either the OneDrive for business or the OneDrive, which is your own personal OneDrive that you use with your Microsoft account. Have those both synced, I have to say the word synced to your device so you can see your files, your storage, and make it available encrypted in the cloud itself. So that's another way, another benefit of having Windows 10 as a platform. And lastly, we have sync your settings. So having data remain synced across multiple Windows 10 machines. So if you have a Surface Pro device and you have a Surface Book and you have another device, all of that data across those different systems can be synced across those platforms.
You can actually see on my screen right now, and I'm just showing you my actual laptop, my Surface, my sync your settings. It's just in the settings app, and you can just type sync your settings and find a setting if you don't feel like browsing for it. And sync my settings on, and I want to sync my theme or my Internet Explorer settings, my passwords. I want to sync my language preferences, ease of access, and there's other Windows settings I can sync between my different devices, all using my same Microsoft account to log into.
And then we move on to more of the security features. So we talked about the general features that are available in Windows 10. There are also security features. Joe mentioned one of them, BitLocker, a very important part, which actually sits in the TPM itself. And also device health. Device health attestation, which is basically a way to measure whether or not your device is booting up properly using some sort of, using the algorithms of determining if for some reason it's not booting fast enough, if it doesn't have the right encryption information. The device health attestation lets us know that the device has not been compromised. Secure boot allows you to, securely boot that system up.
It makes sure that any kind of malware or ransomware that happened to get into that system that might run at boot time can't run at boot time. Now, the thing about secure boot versus anything else on this list is it requires the UEFI BIOS, right? Again, the UEFI BIOS, as does the virtual secure mode, which is a little bit down on the list. So that does require UEFI. So that's one of the reasons why we want you to go to Windows 10 and we want you to upgrade your BIOS from legacy BIOS to UEFI to take advantage of secure boot. Once you have secure boot, you actually get other features available as well, which is on the next slide.
Exactly. So, and then on top of that, the multi-factor authentication, which is if you're in the industry or if you're in the exam, you might see it as two-factor authentication. It allows you to basically be able to identify yourself in terms of access to the device. It goes by those three components: who you are, what you have, and what you know. Right, so you might have your credentials that you can type in. Maybe you have your thumbprint that you're using some sort of thumbprint reader to basically validate that you are actually logging on, or you can use a PIN, for example. So the multi-factor authentication allows you to use more than one factor to actually access your system, and it enforces that with Windows 10. It's just another way to provide more security within the Windows 10 platform. We also take advantage of what we call the virtual secure mode, or VSM, which is basically a way of storing information in a much more secure location on the operating system.
So as an example of VSM, and VSM works with the Hyper-V service, and Hyper-V is installed, or it's a feature that's available in Windows 10. Now, we know Hyper-V as running VMs or virtual machines that could be running Windows 7, even Linux, or Windows 10 versions. But what VSM uses is just the Hyper-V service. You don't need to have a full-blown Hyper-V installation. And it allows you to take advantage of a setting that we call Credential Guard and Device Guard. And Credential Guard, which again, we'll talk about that in the next slide a little bit, but Credential Guard takes your username and password that's kept in a hash in the LSA, and it moves it into that virtual secure mode so that ransomware and those types of attacks can't actually get to it because they're looking in the LSA for it. This virtualizes your credentials to prevent things like pass-the-hash attacks.
And the last feature we want to mention is just the virtual smart card. So if you ever had a physical smart card where you actually have to go into the building and put it against the scanner to actually let you in, we've implemented what we call a virtual smart card that actually allows you to use that same certificate or identifier on your device to access different resources. So it's another way that Windows 10 is providing a little bit more security on the platform when you're needing to access different resources.
Yep, exactly.
With a secure card.
Now, some of the features that we're talking about are available in Enterprise Edition only, and some are available in Pro Edition as well. And Home Edition, for example, BitLocker is also available. We don't have a column there for Home Edition because, again, on this exam, they're not going to ask you about Home Edition, but BitLocker is available on Home Edition and Pro and Enterprise. And things like, Hyper-V can be installed in Pro as long as it's 64-bit Pro. But then as you go down the list, again, Credential Guard to secure against pass-the-hash attacks, or Device Guard, which will allow you to whitelist applications. Your device will only run trusted applications. And you can say all applications, as an example, that come from the Windows Store or come from my SCCM environment are trusted by default. And then I can use App Locker to blacklist from there. Again, also available as Enterprise only.
So make sure you know the difference between what runs on Windows 10 Pro and Windows 10 Enterprise. What we've done for you so far is we've listed them out in this actual PowerPoint so that you can actually see what those features are. Be familiar with each one of these because as you're going through the exam, they might give you a business scenario where they're expecting certain features to be available on certain platforms.
Exactly, and you need to present which platform it's going to work on or which edition should be installed for that scenario.
The next section we go into is really about installing Windows and understanding how you can do what we call a clean install, upgrade, Windows update, anything like that nature, or using just even boot from VHD, which are all options for installing Windows as well. We've already talked about the deployment requirements and how you actually get to it, but once you make that decision that you're going to install Windows, here are some of those features that we kind of start talking about. How do I actually do it? What switches am I going to use to upgrade to Windows 10? So we've listed a few of them out. Some of them are specific to doing a clean upgrade. Others are specific to warning you if there's a driver or boot driver that's needed, or requiring that there be no reboot during the process.
One of these that I like to point out always is the compat, the second one down, and then scan only. And what that allows you to do is actually run. We talked about upgrade readiness earlier, and we talked about Map Toolkit. It'll allow you to run setup on one specific machine, or even send this out as a command as long as you have some way to log it. But on that one specific machine to see if this one device is upgradable to Windows 10. I can run setup.exe, compat, scan only.
Exactly. So as you start that running process, right? So this is just a sample media. If I'm using a media-based installation, I run setup.exe /auto upgrade. It brings this window up and says, hey, do you want to upgrade your system? And it starts the process of configuring the system. You'll see it kind of walk through this screen of options, and at some point it actually does the reboot and continues forward to getting you to the latest version of your operating system.
Now, there's also ways to push out that upgrade, and it's entirely possible in some cases that you don't want to push out the latest upgrade as soon as it's available. We talked about how Creators Update is coming out really soon. Well, the day it comes out, you're not going to push it out to the thousands of machines in your organization. You're going to put some of them into what we call current branch. That means about 10% of your machines or fewer are going to get the newest version, while the other 90% or so aren't going to get it just yet. So here you can see that's all done through group policy. So a device itself is not considered current branch or current branch for business. The operating system that sits on it when it gets installed is when it's either current branch or current branch for business. We do plan to put out a new upgrade about every 6 months. It's not always the case. If you look at 2016, only one update came out then. 2 of them came out in 2015. There's 2 planned for 2017. That's typically what we expect, but it's not always the case. So Windows 10 releases do transition from one stage to the next, from current branch to current branch for business. It's just a declaration from Microsoft that says enough companies around the world are running this operating system at this version that we think it's business ready, and that becomes current branch for business. And again, you can decide either through Windows Update, which we're just getting to on the slide, either through Windows Update or through group policy, through SCCM, when that transitions to that current branch for business.
Again, if you take a look here, it's not so much any different here. Here's where I'm actually going through the process of delaying and forcing the scheduling of the update. So Windows Update then does the exact same thing as if I was doing a normal update and delays it until I'm actually decided to do the upgrade. That just kind of shows you a quick process of what that looks like.
Now, these next several slides, or the next several clicks anyway, are what happens when we do upgrade from current branch to current branch for business. We can set it up through group policy in what we call rings, where we say, okay, these machines are going to get it within 5 days of its release. So let's make up a date. Let's just say May 5th, an edition is coming out. 5 days later, these few machines are going to get it. And then after a little while longer, we go with fast ring, maybe 10 days. And then again, so slow ring, 20 days, and you can decide. And what happens with this is, one of the newest features to group policy with the creators update is, we can actually say, if something happens during this upgrade and something went wrong, then we want to delay all upgrades. So right now we know that everything's right, everything's working, so we're going to go ahead and then slow ring. And again, this is all still part of the current branch and eventually current branch for business. You can actually decide if something was wrong, you can defer those upgrades through group policy as well. That's something new to Creators Update.
Exactly. So, I mean, I really like the fact that you can actually delay that. That saves a lot more time.
It does, because you've already set this up as 5 days, 10 days, but what if you can't fix all the problems in 5 days? Right? And by all the problems, I don't mean all the problems. I mean, you have a couple of drivers that aren't compatible, a couple of applications that aren't compatible that you weren't expecting to not be. Right? So you don't want to now push it out to your thousands of machines or even hundreds of machines knowing you have incompatibility issues. So we also don't want to modify all of your group policies, you just defer upgrades.
So for the exam, what should I be prepared for, Joe?
For the exam, before Creators Update, right? So again, that's the difference. So things are moving fast in Redmond. Depends on when you take the exam. So you want to keep track of all this. But what you should know is that in later versions of Windows 10, you can defer those upgrades for a period of time until you can get everything working and compatible again.
Excellent, excellent. No, that's good to know. So, and then the other two pieces that we want to mention as well is configuring what we call native boot scenarios, where you're allowing the boot to actually occur from a VHD or just a boot partition that contains the files required for boot Windows 10. So here's an example of where we show in the command prompt, bcd edit -v, which is a verbose command, and you basically see the path of where that boot file is located. The boot mgfw.efi is the file that's being used for the extensible firmware interface to allow the installation. And it contains the system partition information, but things to remember. Disk management.msc gives you access to actually see the disk partitions on your device, and BCD Edit is the boot configuration designer access process that actually lets you see what you're running. It identifies what's running on the device, the boot manager, bootloader. These are things that you have to be aware of when you're dealing with booting an image up, right? Yep. And then lastly, we also have what we call the native boot, boot to VHD. So if I were to take a ISO or a VHD, for example, I can once I can convert that ISO to a VHD. The VHD again is almost like a containerized version of the Windows 10 image, and I can mount it onto my disk as a VHD. So basically, you can either create one or attach it as a VHD. And what you can do is you can actually install the operating system on that VHD and attach it to a drive letter on your device.
Right, so don't think of this as Hyper-V, although it probably works with that in the background, right? But we're not saying install the Hyper-V service and then create a VHD and launch it in Hyper-V while your OS is running. We're saying to create this boot to VHD, mount it to your operating system, and then reboot to that VHD file.
Exactly. And so this is what it looks like. If you're opening up disk part, you actually see the different VDisks that you have attached. And here are an example of 3 different VHDs that are running Windows 10. Now there are challenges to this because this might be a scenario where you're actually just testing it out on a non-production system and you are a developer and you want to just test out different versions of the operating system. Once you have a secure platform, it's much harder to run different versions of the operating system simultaneously because of BitLocker and the fact that it's going to be scanning each one of the disks that are actually attached to that platform. So the upgrade process, again, is very important. We added a few additional informations around the language, making sure you have language options.
That's actually pretty important, right? So if you have US English installed on your Windows 7 device, you can't do an in-place upgrade to German language, as an example. The languages have to match. You can do the in-place upgrade to English and then change it to German, but you can't do an in-place upgrade to a different language.
Exactly. And then just remember, disk encryption might be another scenario that you'll have to consider. You'll need a disk. You need to be hooked on to a media, and it works okay with task sequences as well. So BitLocker is probably the most easiest way to kind of deal with this process.
Absolutely, because BitLocker will pause itself during the upgrade where third-party ones may not. So later versions of Windows do have ways around that as well, so make sure you're familiar with that.
So we wanted to make sure we reviewed just the installation requirements. not just the installation requirements, but the actual installation steps and things to consider when you're installing Windows 10. And hopefully this is helpful for you as you prepare for that process of running Windows 10 on the platform, as well as the additions and the features within it.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us. In this section, we cover configuring devices and device drivers and all other installation requirements. We take a deeper dive into drivers, managing packages, and other scenarios that might help you properly install Windows and use it on your platform. When we're thinking about just the different scenarios, we really have to know what tools we're working with. One of those, for example, might be the DISM tool, the Deployment Image and Service Management tool that's packages. So we'll go over each one of these so that you understand what other scenarios you need to consider when you're installing Windows 10. In this section, we really want to focus on things around drivers. What do I need to know to make sure that once I install Windows 10, that the drivers are properly working and I don't have to worry about additional concerns?
Right. There's one thing that we mentioned in an earlier video series about the upgrade readiness tool that will allow you to make sure your drivers all work on Windows 10 before you do the upgrade. And there's also, again, if you did a setup.exe and then upgrade scan only, that will also tell you whether your drivers work or not. Now, Windows wants to automatically update drivers. If you have an internet connection, when you run the setup, it wants to connect to Windows Update and update those drivers to the latest version of the drivers. And that's part of what we call dynamic update. So it wants to do that for you already. But you can prevent driver updates over metered connection by using group policy to either prevent driver updates automatically or by marking your connection in your network interface card as a metered connection, and then drivers will not automatically update as long as it is a metered connection. Metered meaning you're paying by the usage of that connection.
We've also included a number of commands. PNP util, plug and play util, is a command that you can actually use to sign your drivers.
Right.
That's also important. So this might be something you might see in the exam. I also know, for driver verification, you might use the SIG file or the verifier itself to validate the drivers that you have running on your platform. So those are other things that you might see on the exam that you want to really kind of think about. And Joe knows as much as I do, the drivers are a big portion of deploying Windows 10.
Oh, absolutely. It's the biggest reason why companies don't migrate as fast as they should, because they're afraid that their custom drivers or their display drivers and stuff like that won't work properly. As a matter of fact, with display drivers, talking about that, display drivers and Bluetooth drivers specifically, I just talked about setup doing a dynamic update of your drivers. It wants to do that, but it doesn't do it with Bluetooth drivers and display drivers.
Absolutely, and we've listed that so that you can actually know exactly how to deal with dynamic updates or display and Bluetooth drivers.
And of course, anything custom that you might have at your company, maybe you created a new piece of hardware and it uses a custom driver. Obviously, that wouldn't upgrade automatically as well. So make sure you understand all that.
And we dive also into post-installation configuration. So this is after I've deployed Windows 10. So everything's running now, Joe. What are we going to do? How do we now further configure our devices to support Windows 10?
Yep, so we talk about when you first get a device and you're going to run through this, what we call OOBE, right? This OOBE setup, OOBE, or out-of-box experience. One of the things it wants to do first is maybe install a provisioning package. So we've talked about that in the other video series. So we're talking now, we've already logged in successfully. Now's when we're going to meet Cortana. We're going to talk about Microsoft Edge and decide, we need to customize some of these applications that come with our current branch for business versions of Windows.
So the first thing we do is meet Cortana. Hello. Hey, Cortana. And if you haven't yet had a chance to work on Windows 10, which hopefully many of you have, Cortana is your personal assistant. And you hear that quite a bit because what it does is it's integrated with Bing and the search possibilities to be able to find information on your device within, by just configuring it so that you can actually tell it what you need.
And not only that, but what Cortana can also do, we talked about earlier, it can read your calendar and remind you, hey, it's time to go. Because of traffic, it's going to take you this long to get to the airport or to get to your next lunch meeting.
Or it might tell you about calls that you've missed, or give you information on device search history, or web search history. So Cortana may be something you get to enable. So if you're doing a initial installation of a Windows 10 Enterprise system, it gives you the option to enable Cortana the very first time, if you're doing like a wipe and load or whatever. And also, even if you're doing an upgrade, you get that option. Do you want to turn on Cortana? And the minute you turn it on, it gives you the option to further configure it. So,
hi, what's your name? You know, you put your name in there. You can put whatever you want. I think in an earlier screenshot it said Joey Southside, because I am Joey Southside. So you actually saw in one of the earlier screenshots, good morning, Joey Southside.
Exactly. So, and here just gives you an example of how you can actually set it up. Now, once you have those settings configured and you're working, then really you can manage this through group policy, correct?
Yep, Cortana can be managed through group policy. Not completely, but there's a lot of settings that can be managed through group policy. Like a setting that can't be, it doesn't know your name through group policy. You'd have to set that up with your name and whatnot. But most things can be managed right through group policy if you need to. And after Cortana, again, we talked about Client Hyper-V. We've talked about that in the past. So Client Hyper-V, just like the server Hyper-V, allows you to run virtual machines right on your desktop so that you might have a lab environment. I have on my desktop, I have my lab environment running on Hyper-V. And you can see my Hyper-V client is installed. Here's my desktop name. I have a Windows 7 VM, a Windows 10 VM, and several Server 2016 VMs as well. My Windows 10 one is running. And it's right here, right? So I have 2 instances of Windows 10 running on my desktop, one's in a virtual machine.
So when was Hyper-V introduced to Windows?
Windows Client, it was introduced in Windows 8. It got better in Windows 10. And what we can do today, and I don't have this configured today, but what we can do is inside of my VM, I can install Hyper-V and create a VM. So we have nested VM possibilities in Windows 10 Hyper-V, where we didn't have that in the past. And as a matter of fact, even with Hyper-V Server, you need Server 2016 Hyper-V to get that nested VM capabilities.
Exactly. So that's another feature we wanted to mention. The other one we have with Hyper-V that's built in is just the checkpoints. And the checkpoint, again, is very similar to
It used to be called a snapshot.
Right, so you're basically building an image, and then you can actually take a checkpoint, which basically says, at this point in time, this Windows 10 image was configured with these settings, with this configuration, and I want to revert back to that specific checkpoint. So you can have a number of checkpoints. It gets stored in the actual directory, and we've kind of given you sort of a step-by-step on how to actually turn on the Hyper-V Manager and use it for checkpoints.
And one thing that we don't have here is when you create a virtual hard disk to be used in Hyper-V, you can create what we call a parent disk or a differencing disk. For the exam, you want to know the difference between that. And as an example, again, as I go into my Hyper-V, what I've done is I created, and I don't have it here because you don't need the virtual machine settings file for parent, but I created a Server 2016 parent virtual hard disk. And then when I went to create my DC1, my Server 1, my Server 2, I created a differencing disk off of that. So instead of having 4 different VHDs of 20 gig or more each, I have one that's 20 gig, and then the rest of them are nice and small. They're just differencing disks. So we can do that with Client Hyper-V.
Exactly. So this kind of shows you the details again. Now, the other things that we want you to think about is when you're implementing Windows in an enterprise, the servicing requirements. So we mentioned the WSIM tool earlier. Again, that's going to come back up again because that's also important. The key management services, basically making sure that you can actually activate it using Active Directory-based activation, as well as the UAC, the user account control settings in your actual system. Don't forget group policies. Group policies also help you manage it. So these are all of the post-installation things that you need to consider. And we're going to go over a few of those today. WSIM provisioning tool, we talked about it earlier.
We talked about WSIM in the first series that we did for this exam. As you said before, you can create provisioning packages. You can do basic settings. You can point to that provisioning package during UBI and get a functional provisioned workstation. And
this is important to note because you can either do it as part of a new base image, you can do a wipe and upgrade, and also a in-place upgrade, and then run the provisioning package. Yep. So it's not just the post-installation solution.
That's true. And even through PowerShell or DISM, SCCM, you can push out a provisioning package to existing machines. It's getting easier as Windows 10 matures and gets more features available to it. But that is one of the things that is getting much easier is pushing out that provisioning package.
Exactly. And provisioning packages really come into play because it's a very easy way to add additional configurations. Now, it's not a compliance tool. A compliance tool like SCCM, desired state configuration, will require that your system meet a certain configuration. So the configuration designer sets a set of settings on your device, but it doesn't enforce those settings.
That's true. One of the settings it could do is you could have Windows 10 Professional, and I mentioned earlier in another series that you can take Windows 10 Professional, change the key, and it becomes Enterprise automatically. You can do that with a provisioning package. So we're looking at the Windows 10 activation methods, and we talked about a couple of them already: KMS, Active Directory-based activation. Now, what you need to know for this exam is when would I use a MAC key or a multiple activation key, and when would I use a KMS server? So we have the advantages here on when I would use one or the other. Again, a MAC key, a single activation key, it can be used multiple times. So we have the disadvantages listed there as well. And same thing with KMS. So with the KMS, the key management server is required for a KMS, and it does require activation renewals. So take a look at that and know the difference between when I would use one or the other.
And the big difference now is the activation, Active Directory-based activation, really allows you to configure the activation to happen when a device actually joins the Active Directory infrastructure.
As soon as it joins the domain. That was introduced in Windows Server 2012 R2, Active Directory, the Active Directory-based activation of the desktops, right? So as soon as they join the domain, they can make sure that their Windows is activated.
So you have three options. If you're going to activate Windows 10, you can use a MAC key, multiple activation key. You can use a KMS server and have a KMS configuration set up, or you can integrate that with Active Directory and have it integrated so that when you do join the domain, you can choose, you can have a key assigned to your device. Yep. Now, there's a certain amount of time that you can actually remove the device from the Active Directory environment, which will basically force it to say, I need to check in to make sure that the device is still valid. And after that time, it's going to let you know that you need to reactivate the device.
Now, important to note also for the exam, if it's no longer activated, if it falls out of activation for that scenario, as Alf was just saying, you disjoin it from the domain and a period of time goes by and it's no longer activated, the machine's not going to break. It's not going to brick itself. It's not going to shut down. It's going to shut down periodically, so it's going to be inconvenient to use, is the big thing to note.
Yep. So for the exam, just know that you have three options to choose from. Obviously, the manual one is probably the fourth one, where you actually go in and enter that key, but they really don't test you on whether or not you can manually enter a key or not. The other thing to think about is activation options, where you can actually decide on whether or not you're going to use the KMS activation or just use a basic or base activation option, where we can have different sorts of activations: retail activations, volume licensing, using a VL key, and just using different commands to actually do the activation.
Right, and you'll see SLMGR VBS file. The VBS script being used a lot for this. You'll see it when we're changing a key for whatever reason. If we have to change a key, again, from Pro to Enterprise, so you have to reactivate. If you did that manually, you might have to use an SLMGR. Or to wipe out a key, because you're running a sysprep, so you want to wipe out that activation key. You'll use SLMGR as well.
And you can use SLMGR to actually see what key you have in there.
Right.
And we've put that command in there for you, so you have that as a reference point. And here we talked about the activation, using Active Directory activation. Again, this is a new feature, so don't be surprised if you see it on the exam. It really tests you on that knowledge of understanding how Active Directory activation works. And here's an example of a system that actually has the activation enabled through the Windows 10 activation built into Active Directory.
All right, so we just took a look at, again, the activation methods and some post-installation things like, again, like Cortana and Hyper-V. And now we're going to take a look at user account control. User account control was introduced, how many versions ago? Windows 7?
Yeah,
Windows Vista, right? Windows
Vista, yes.
Introduced UAC, user account control, and it was very restrictive in the Windows Vista days. And that actually was one of the downfalls of Windows Vista, was it was too restrictive.
The interesting here is the reason why, Joe, I looked at Joe, and the irony is that Windows 10 has done a really good job of perfecting, or at least refining how this user account control system works. When Windows Vista was out, it was probably just as efficient, but people weren't used to having prompts and requests.
It was really restrictive, and most companies just turned it off.
Exactly.
Raise your hand if you turned off UAC
Yeah.
in Windows Vista and kept it off in Windows 7, right?
Yeah.
You just did. Windows 10 does a really good job of it. There's things in Windows Vista, in order to create a VPN connection, you needed to be an administrator, and now you don't, because personally you may need a VPN connection to connect to work. So what we have is some benefits of user account control. Your users don't all need to be administrators. There's the big benefit. They don't need to all be admins, right? Before user account control was enabled, it was too restrictive, so either you turned it off or everyone was an admin. Now you can have it turned on and still prevent the malware. It runs in a secure context. Right, so there's still some benefits to running user account control.
Yeah, so know what users need to be able to do and set your policies against that within the user account controls. The intention of the user account controls is to allow users to be able to perform functions on the Windows 10 device based on their level of required access,
right,
and then prevent them from being able to change things that do not need that level, that do not require them to be changed. A good example might be the time on your clock. We had a huge challenge with making sure people could actually change the time on the clock, and UAC actually controls those settings as well.
And a really big one, especially for the exam, is application compatibility. I have an application in Windows 7 that's compatible with Windows 10 as long as you use an administrator. So what do? I do an in-place upgrade, but then the user has to be an administrator. Well, we can do with user account control, and with, again, we can create a shim of that application to make sure that the application will run with the proper settings without the user being an administrator.
Yep. So know when you need elevation and when elevation is not required. So there are certain features that may be that will require elevation, and there's others that don't. There are, so for example, some of those might be, viewing Windows 10 settings, pairing a Bluetooth device, they don't require that elevation.
Exactly.
But also know that things like, installing and removing applications on the device requires elevation. And if you don't want your users to have that ability, you need to set your UAC accordingly.
Or even just modifying UAC settings. Is UAC enabled?
Exactly.
Enabling BitLocker, disabling BitLocker. Actually, enabling BitLocker is not UAC. Disabling it, I believe, is UAC.
Exactly. And the reason why these settings are here is enterprises really want to protect the integrity of their operating system. They want to make sure that the systems do not become compromised. And the user account control settings really give them that power, the IT administrative control back, and allow them to further protect what users are doing on those devices.
It's funny and almost ironic that Windows 10 is the most secure operating system, and it really is. I know I sound like a salesman, not an exam prep trainer, but it's the most secure operating system, and one of the reasons for that is because UAC became less restrictive, right? We are now allowing standard users to do more, so Windows 10 is more secure. And the irony there is because before a user had to be an admin to pair a Bluetooth device. It had to be an admin to create a VPN connection. So once they're an admin, right? So now they don't have to be an admin to do those simple, not simple, but those tasks.
Again, post-installation requirements, this is one of those that we wanted to make sure that we mentioned to you. User account controls, but as well, group policies. And if you've ever worked in this platform, group policies are really what drive the consistency of controls on those devices. And as you're preparing for the exam, make sure that you're familiar with what group policies are, how they work, when you can use them, and what's new when it comes to Windows 10.
Now, what's new with Windows 10, obviously there's not just 4 new policies with Windows 10 from Windows 7. There's actually hundreds, probably. So make sure you know what they are. We've listed a few of them here. Start screen and start menu improvements, management. One of those things you can do with Windows 10 Enterprise, you can force specific tiles on a specific portion of the start screen to all of your users, and that was never possible before. It's actually only possible in Windows 10 Enterprise Edition to force that out to all of your users. So take a look at some of these settings. There's a lot of them. One thing I also want to mention with group policy, you can see from my own machine, I just opened up a Microsoft Management Console. And one thing I can do with group policy on my Windows 10 machine is I can add remove snap-in, and I can add group policy object editor, add to my local machine, finish, and then I can add another one that is going to go, it's going to pertain to my non-admin users. Finish, and yet one more that's going to pertain to my admin users. Okay, and now if we're talking about group policy. Now we're talking about group policy in an enterprise, but even on a local machine, maybe that's not connected to your domain, it's a kiosk machine or it's sitting in a guest cube, we can now create these different policy settings like we could in the enterprise, even ones that pertain only to non-admin policy user config and admin policy user config. So this is all part of group policy with Windows 10 as well.
So as a Windows 10 administrator, as an IT administrator, one of the other things you have to be familiar with in the enterprise is managing objects in Active Directory. So Active Directory terms are things that you should be fairly familiar with. OUs, sites and subnets, domain trees, organizational units, global catalog servers, all are terms that are used when you're managing those devices in your Active Directory environment. Now, there's quite a bit of organizations that have Active Directory, so do expect this to be questions that you are challenged on in
absolutely,
the exam.
because we're talking about group policy, right? And group policy can be linked at the site, it can be linked at the domain, it can be linked at the organizational unit, and you'll get different policies based on where it is and how many policies there are and where it's linked. So you do need to know these terms for this exam.
So we've shown that to you as well. Again, very important. So we're going to start off and talk about just a practice question that you might get in this scenario. So you are planning your company's user account control policies and need to provide the security team with a list of actions which do not require UAC. Which of the following actions do not require UAC? And we'll ask you to select three.
Yep. Select three, and this might be click them from the left to the right, it just might be select three. It almost never will say select all that apply. They don't do that on questions any longer. As of today, they don't do it on questions any longer. I don't know that they never will. So it will say select the three. In this case, we had a slide earlier that mentioned some of these. So installing Windows updates, configuring Windows update settings, installing a device from a USB drive, pairing a Bluetooth microphone. So in this case, we've already seen installing Windows updates, pairing a Bluetooth device, and then our accessibility options would be the answers here.
And so that really covers much of what we wanted to talk about from a module standpoint. So a couple things you want to keep in mind. Tip number one is make sure you're thinking about user state migration tools, because that's also very important. How you're going to upgrade your operating system, what you're going to use, whether you're going to restore the data, whether you're going to deal with BIOS or UEFI. Tip number two is make sure you know how you're activating the device. Are you using an Active Directory-based activation model, KMS, or MAC key? And tip number three is make sure that you're know exactly where you're going from. If you're going from a 32-bit operating system to a64, whether you want to do something like a wipe and load.
And you see there we have in tip number three, as of today, the exam does not include Anniversary Edition or Creators Update. As we said, things are moving quickly, and the exams are actually, we joke around about things what we call exam as a service, and this exam is being updated probably every 6 months or so. So by the time you take this exam, it very well may have Anniversary Update or even Creators Edition versions of group policy available.
So we've done our best to make sure we cover as much content as possible for Module 1. Lastly, considering all of the requirements that are needed for actually post-configuration. So we hope this is helpful for you as you prepare for the exam, and we'll see you in the next module. In this module, we're going to cover configuring services, the core services of Windows 10, and we're going to focus more on network and storage on Windows 10 as it sits. The important thing to remember about configuring support and core services is there are a number of different features in the platform that need to be configured correctly for it to work the way you want it to. And we've listed out for the exam purposes what those topics are and how you can prepare for just those topics themselves. Everything from IPv4, IPv6, all the way down to direct access as a feature.
Yep.
Now, some of these solutions may be deprecated, but they're still relevant for the exam, so you should know exactly when and where to use those functionalities within the platform. We start off with looking at IPv4. And IPv4, again, is probably an age-old technology.
When was IPv4 introduced with Windows, right? I mean, this is forever. IPv4 is 30 years old.
It is the way to recognize PCs on the network.
Yep.
So IPv4 is our standard for providing addresses for systems, and probably the prerequisite to making sure that you can actually access resources in a network organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's terms that you'll need to know with IPv4, like automatic private IP addressing, the APIPA address. Now, you may get a question on the exam that goes something like, your user's IP address is shown in the display, and it starts with 169.254.something.something, 255.255.0.0 subnet mask. That's an automatic private IP address. If your DHCP server is unavailable to give an IP address, your client will automatically assign itself one in the 169.254 range. So you need to know that. Also need to know DHCP server, the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol server that hands out IP addresses.
Exactly. And again, that is a server functionality, but it's still important. The other thing you'll have to keep in mind is the difference between what we consider IPv4 and IPv6. Because of the naming standards, IPv4 and IPv6 have a different way of identifying, addresses within a network. However, they are used as two ways to indicate what your address is on the network. You can have both of them configured, and you can typically see that within your network settings if you go into the settings app as well.
You can even see it as I go into my machine. I'm going to open up a command prompt. I'm just going to type a very basic ipconfig. And I can see that I have my IPv6 address. That's the really long string broken down into all these different numbers and integers. And I have my IPv4 address. It says IPv4, 10.121.121. So I can see here my IPv4 and my IP6 on the same network adapter. And as you said, you may have both of them configured, and I do have both of them configured here through DHCP, through Microsoft.
And DHCP now can actually allocate addresses for both DHCP IPv4 and IPv6. Yep. So those are options that you can actually configure DHCP, which is basically the idea that you're providing the device an IP address in the specific range or location of where that PC is plugged into within your network.
Now, something else you'll want to know about IPv4 and IPv6 is, again, on my machine, looking at my command prompt, I can do a ping, and I can just ping my local host address, and it's going to automatically do it as IPv6. That's the default. So you can see it as : 1. That's my IPv6 address. If I wanted to do it, ping localhost, and find out what my IPv4 address is, I can do 4, and it will tell me it is 127.0.0.1 as localhost. If I did it by my name, I'd actually get the actual address. So you can see different ways that I can determine what my IPv6 or IPv4 address is.
The other thing to keep in mind is knowing the difference between a simple network and a complex network. Again, because IP addresses are given out based on a specific range, a simple network might be just a range with a way of identifying it within a shorter a larger pool of addresses, whereas as you get complex, you start basically...
we know it as like CIDR notation, right? So you have the simple network might have a 255.255.255.0 subnet mask, or 255.0.0.0 subnet mask, where CIDR notation, 255.255.124.0, right? So now you're saying, okay, I have more subnets available to me through this subnet mask, but I have fewer IP addresses within each subnet. And it just allows you to expand out your one subnet mask into several smaller networks.
You may have a question or two around simple networks or complex networks, so know the difference between when you're dealing with one or the other. The third thing to be aware of is what we consider private IP addressing. So if you're dealing with having a private IP address range that is only available on a local system, for example, and we call that an APIPA address, automatic private IP addressing, is a way of giving or assigning your device
Auto-assigning a device an IP address that it's non-routable.
Non-routable address.
Yep. So I mentioned it a few minutes ago about your DHCP service simply unavailable. That's not always the case. It could be that you're on a small network and you just don't need a DHCP server. You have fewer than 250 machines that need to connect to each other, no routers. You just have them all do an IP, automatically get an IP APIPA address.
Exactly. Know the difference between Class A, Class B, and Class C networks. 10.0.0 is typically a Class A network. Class B is 172, and you'll see the address there, and 192 is a Class C address. So these address ranges really allow you to separate where your infrastructure is accessing resources. You can have a DMZ environment that's 172 in address. You can have an internal address that's 192 and another domain that's 10.0.0.
As long as your router can route between them, you're good.
Exactly. And so you'll see a lot of organizations use this as a way to route between different network environments in their organization. So they will test you on this, and they'll expect you to understand how each one of these work, and understanding also what ranges are, what subnet ranges are, and how they actually fit into the model of providing access based on that specific range.
Now, when you first get an IP address, so you enable your network card, whether it's in Hyper-V or it's on your physical network card, your big blue bar is going to pop up saying, what kind of network is this? Is this my domain network, my private network? Do you want to be discoverable on the network? So you can see we've listed out those network locations here as a domain network, a private network, or a guest network, and you can see the blue bar. We put the picture of it at the bottom. So basically the difference is if you're in a domain network, your machine's automatically going to be discoverable, meaning other machines on your network can search for you just by doing maybe a NetBIOS query. A private network, also you're discoverable, but it's typically a smaller network, maybe at home. A guest network, you go plug in at the local coffee shop or at the library, or somewhere else like that where you don't want to be discoverable. You don't want other machines to be able to discover your machine is there. So once you join a domain, you join your Active Directory domain, you're automatically going to be in the domain network. If you're in a work group, you can choose between private and guest network.
The other feature to think about is Windows firewalls. The Windows firewall and advanced firewalls are concepts that are also native to Windows 10. Making sure you know where to set those settings in your Windows 10 is crucial to the understanding of how to prepare for the exam. So we've done our best to make sure that we've shown you sort of the control panel location of where Windows Firewall can be found on your device. Now, we know a lot's changing. So with the Windows 10 platform, a lot of these features are now being moved into the Settings app.
Right now, the firewall is one of those features that some things can be done in the classic control panel, and of course some things can be done in the Settings app. Probably in a future version of Windows it'll all be in the Settings app, or even just in the advanced firewall.
So the things to keep in mind around the firewall and the concepts around it is the fact that you can have 3 different networks, as Joe alluded to earlier: domain, private, public networks. And you can configure firewalls for each one of those networks depending on what you decide in your organization.
Again, when you join a guest network, for example, it's automatically discovery is turned off. You can't be discovered. But you could actually go into a firewall and actually get more granular on what's allowed. And of course, then there's the advanced firewall, which is also, it's one of our MMC consoles, which allows you to do, instead of just saying, okay, you're discoverable or not, you can say this specific traffic on this specific port is allowed in or allowed out. You can get very granular, like you can with a network appliance firewall.
We've also listed out a few commands that you can actually use for PowerShell. If we haven't stated this already, these PowerShell commands are also very relevant on the exam because of the fact that many of these solutions or features are being rewritten or configured to use these PowerShell commands. We want to make sure that you're aware of them. A good example is getting the information around your firewall rules, or setting a set of firewall rules based on some policies that you decide on your environment. So we've listed some of these out. If you pulled up PowerShell and you ran the command on the Windows 10 box, you'd get a list of options. You can just type in get help space get net firewall rule, and you'll see a list of options available.
Now, setting the firewall for this exam, you should notice in PowerShell that we have the very top one is a get net firewall rule, and the bottom one is a set net firewall rule. Know the difference between get and set. Definitely for all of these Microsoft exams, that's one of the things they want to make sure you understand is the verb. Are you getting this, so you just want to list it out, or are you setting it, so you want to make it a policy? The other thing you want to note is we didn't put a command here for this, but net shell, the old net sh command, is still alive and well on Microsoft exams. So know how to set firewall rules through net shell as well.
Wi-Fi settings and Wi-Fi Direct are also components that you can actually build into your operating system as well. Oh, they're built in, of course, and now you don't have to built in, but knowing what options you need to select. And so what we've shown is a set of different ways to deal with Wi-Fi settings. So if you have different modes, we can have ad hoc, Wi-Fi Direct, where you're basically directly connecting to a Wi-Fi setting, or an infrastructure-based configuration. We also have standards where we can use the 802.11 standard as a configuration for Wi-Fi, and as well as infrastructure, and then Wi-Fi security. What sort of Wi-Fi security are we setting? Are we using a web key? Are we using a Wi-Fi protected access where you have a specific area that's protected, or using WPA2? They will test you on the differences and understanding when you'd actually use it. So remember, WEP is an older wireless security standard and a number of documented security issues surround it. So using WEP you only want to use that if that's
if there's
your
no
only
choice, right? If there's no other option, you can use WEP. But most of us are going to be using WPA2. It's the de facto standard for Wi-Fi security.
Right, and with WPA, there's either both personal and there's also enterprise, and those two options are optional for you to decide whether or not you want to use the enterprise version of WPA or use a personal settings for WPA. So we've also shown exactly where you'd actually configure it. This is a newer platform on Windows 10 that allow you to decide on whether you have your Wi-Fi settings on, whether you're going to use hotspots, because again, hotspots is something that I think you might actually see on the exam because it's a newer feature.
Not only that, but with Windows 10, because it's Windows 10, Windows 10 Mobile as a hotspot is actually really good.
Exactly.
So you may see that as well.
And lastly, the paid Wi-Fi services. If you need to get online when you're on by using some sort of paid Wi-Fi services, you can actually enable it and use that to manage your payments for the Wi-Fi access.
Yeah, troubleshooting network issues. There's not a lot of anything new here. You're still going to do an IP config. You're going to do a ping. You're going to do all the old commands that you're used to. I showed you one of the things you can do with ping is you can just say, I want to know what my IP address, my IPv4 ping is, so you do a -4. So know the scope of the issue. Is this affecting everyone on your LAN? Is it affecting just you, just one or two machines? Check your infrastructure. Make sure your routers are working. Make sure your IP helpers are working. Make sure your DHCP server is working. So understand the IP address, understand the scope of that problem, again, and this other infrastructure as well. And test communication by doing a ping or an IP config or an ARP or any, the normal standard network commands. So we have a practice question here for you. So raise your hand if you know this question. You are the help desk technician at Contoso. A user calls you because they are unable to access a resource on server 1. You ask the user for the IP address of the computer and walk the user through getting you that information. The user's IP address is displayed to the right. What should you do? Again, so you would have a display there. And you can see here in this case, IPv4 address, you have a WINS proxy enabled, IP routing enabled. You want to look at the whole picture. And so do you want to A, add a default gateway? Do you want to B, enable IP routing? Do you want to C, check the DHCP server to see if it's online? Or D, check the DNS server to see if it's online? We talked about 169.254 is a PIPA, which means there's no DHCP server available. So the answer here is C.
Check the DHCP server to see if it's online and has IP address. That kind of gives you an idea of what we're dealing with networking. The other side of this is storage. So we talked about networking, DHCP, DNS, IP addressing, PIPA addresses. Storage is another side of Windows 10 that actually allows you to manage the disk, whether you're running a VHD, whether you're dealing with storage spaces, or whether you're troubleshooting storage. So this portion also covers what configuration is required when you're dealing with Windows 10 storage. The first and probably the most important place to look for information is on the disk management console. Yep. So if you type in disk mgmt.msc on your device, it will bring up your disk management configuration. Understand the terms that we've listed here. Volumes. What are volumes? How are they configured and used on a device? You can have mirrored volumes, you can have span volumes, you can have striped volumes.
Most of us think of this console right here. You look at the disk management MMC and you're thinking, oh, that's a server thing. My servers are going to have mirrored volumes or spanned volumes or striped volumes. My desktops aren't going to have that, but that's not the case, right? In a smaller company, your Windows 10 machine might be acting as a server, hosting certain roles, and you do want to span the disk or you do want to mirror the disk for fault tolerance and whatnot. So make sure you're familiar with this, even if you're not a server admin.
Exactly. So volumes are basically designed to allocate storage to a specific space. So you can allocate it in different formats, whether if you're thinking about mirrored means I have this volume of data and I've made a copy of it and had it available on a second copy of of a disk. Striped might be having the data written across 3 or 4 different disks, and span means I have a volume that has the data across multiple disks as well. So know when you're going to use one versus the other and when they matter. The disk partitions, again, with the newer format, GPT, grid partition tables, are also very important. Master boot records, or MBRs, are the older formats of using disks. They're still relevant, they still work. They're just not as expandable as the grid partition tables of the GPT.
That's right. And we talked about in an earlier series about going from BIOS to UEFI, and that's part of that as well. It's going from the GPT, or going from MBR to GPT. That's part of that BIOS to UEFI transition as well.
Exactly. And so GPT, again, one of the main differences is that you can actually have disks that are larger than 2 gigabytes in space. That's also important because now your disk size can actually be much larger without having to worry about it working the way you want to. And this is also important when you're dealing with VHDs because if you set your GPT, you can actually you can set it as a GPT. You can actually have bigger disks when you're using VHDs as well. Then also keep in mind what file system you're running. So NTFS, FAT32, FAT, extensible FAT drive. So file attribute. I can't remember what the T stands for, but
it's funny.
These are different
file allocation table.
File allocation table. There you go. Yeah, I gotta write that 3 times
That was
fast.
a Windows NT when back in the day. There's not a lot of FAT anymore, FAT32. It's all been NTFS ever since.
NTFS is the default file system that's typically used in the organization. But now you're seeing a lot more with the Windows 10 talk about ReFS.
ReFS, yeah.
ReFS being your recovery options around, if a disk fails or if a file fails, it can actually, deal with that in a much more resilient manner. It's a resilient file system is all it is, and it's just there. It does a better job of checking for corruption on the actual file itself. So know the differences between NTFS, FAT32 when you use one versus the other. And the last thing is to remember what your disk management tools are. We have disk management as an option. We showed you that as a screen right now. And then there's also the Windows PowerShell, which you can actually use to programmatically configure settings. And lastly, disk part,
which is, again, it's old school, but it still works. It's very scriptable, so you can push out disk configurations as well, or you can have it as part of your task sequence to create partitions by using a disk part command.
Now, virtual disks also are a big portion of Windows 10. Even though we talk about them for Server 2016, you can actually use that as well in Windows 10 because of the fact that you're able to leverage what we call storage spaces. Now, storage spaces, again, allow you to save a number of files to 2 or more drives and help protect that information across those different drives. And it lets you just easily add more drives if you run low on a specific drive, or if you have an issue, you can just basically link those drives and make that change so that the data remains accessible amongst those drives. So think about it as a virtual disk where you're taking a bunch of disks, and we call them JBODs, right? Assigning them to the Windows 10 operating system, and then saying treat these as a single drive.
As a single drive letter.
And then you can literally carve out of those 3 hard disks, virtual disk that are now assigned to a specific drive letter. So if the data is written there, it will retrieve it from, it might be on disk 1 or disk 2 or disk 3, but because it's a virtual disk, you can actually retrieve it. So that ability to kind of provide that flexibility is something you'll be challenged on, knowing when to actually use the storage spaces and make that available on the platform. And it's very easy, very simple to configure, but the benefits is now you can actually check for storage space. You can actually see if you're running out of space and decide on options on how to make sure that you don't run into issues when it comes to disk usage. Now, the other thing to think about is the options around what we call thin provisioning or thick provisioning. Now, thin provisioning is I'm going to allocate a set of space on the storage, but I'm not going to fully allocate that disk drive to that space. So it really is a thin provisioning. It shows that it has 2 terabytes available, but it will only use what you put on it. And as you add more data to it, it utilizes it or pulls it over from wherever it needs to make up that thin provision. Thick provisions means I'm going to basically allocate 2 gigabytes or whatever number of disk space to this specific drive. And at that point, that thick provisioning gives me the knowledge that the data will always be there, the space will always be there regardless of what I do to actually put information on there. So know the difference between thin and thick provisioning. Understand when you're going to deal with simple two-way, three-way mirroring, because again, mirroring might help out when you're dealing with multiple drives, or if you're dealing with what we call parity. Parity means if you have 3 disks and for some reason you lose one of those disks, you can easily at some point decide on whether or not you want to replace disk 2 or disk 3 and get things back up and
without
running.
losing your data is the important part.
Exactly. So storage spaces are very important in this piece. And the last thing is configuring data access and usage. We think about Windows 10 and the files and printers, the folder shares, the file systems that we have on there, in addition to the OneDrive or any location where we're actually going to store data, also becomes very important. So this section basically covers the importance of making sure you know how to deal with the file shares and all the different scenarios around file access. It covers folder permissions, which is an age-old technology. It uses a server message block, which allows you to decide on what types of permissions that you provide users based on their role and where they need access to on a specific document.
Now, one thing that's important to note with shared folder permissions is it actually, and you mentioned server messenger block, SMB, it actually only works over the network. So if I connect to server 1, start to run whack server 1 or to map drive, and I go to the share permissions are counted against my access or towards my access. But if I RDP into that server and browse through File Explorer, then the share permissions don't do anything for me. That's only NTFS permissions at that point. So the share permissions are only over the network.
So we covered network, we covered file storage, and we covered as well as the file access. So these are 3 different areas within the platform that you have to kind of be aware of once you have your Windows 10 up and running. They're all part of making sure you have access to the storage and network configuration and a number of different tools.
And remember, we've mentioned that OneDrive is a big part of this, so make sure you understand how OneDrive works if you're not using it, because just because we didn't have a slide on it doesn't mean it's not important. It's a very big part of this exam. This section, this whole Module 1 section is 30% of the exam, and OneDrive is a piece of that as well.
Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll hope you enjoyed the section. In this section, we cover implementing apps and also remote management as components that you can actually configure in Windows 10. Now, without the applications running on the device on Windows 10, it makes it really difficult to really actually get anything done. So, needless to say, applications are fairly important when it comes to Windows 10 because that's what the users are actually accessing. So in this section, we're going to cover the desktop apps, startup options, anything that has to do with Windows Store for Business, and just creating packages and provisioning packages as well. And we'll also talk about just using the assessment deployment kit to create those packages. So these are all pieces that are part of implementing what we consider applications running on the device itself. Now, if I were to sit here and talk to you about binaries, MSIs, and executables, it would make it a very uncomfortable conversation because, an MSI or executable is something that you should expect to see on a Windows device as we know it. Now, we're moving into the world of Windows stores and Windows Store for Business. So we want to spend a little bit of time and talk to you about why that's important. So Windows Store is essentially a way of managing access to universal Windows applications that are hosted in the Windows Store.
Yep, you'll see the term UWP, the Universal Windows Platform, right, or Universal Windows Applications. A lot of us remember them as modern apps back when Windows 8 when they first came out, but they are Universal Windows Applications. And you can see we have on the screen, integrate the user's Microsoft account into the organization. So we can do that so that you have the Windows Store for Business that can actually use your O365 or your Azure AD account now in today's Windows Store for Business. So again, as things are moving quickly, things are changing, and one of those things is you can use Azure AD in the Windows Store for Business now.
So we've mentioned a few ways you can actually deal with managing Windows Store, Windows applications. We talked about using Intune, Microsoft Intune, to deliver an application to a device, whether it be a mobile application, Whether it be a Universal Windows app or an MSI, you can actually deliver it with Microsoft Intune down to a device. You can use SCCM or System Center Configuration Manager to deliver an application to a device. Or even you can use other tools like software, a group policy to actually deliver application and group policy preferences to push an application down. So a number of methods that you could actually leverage to actually deliver an application down to a device. And those are things that we want you to be sort of cognizant of as you're going into this exam.
And don't forget to mention side-loading applications. Side-loading an application means I'm getting it from the Windows Store, but I'm not publishing it from the Windows Store. I'm installing it, but I'm not actually publishing it from the store. I'm side-loading it onto the image itself.
Now, Windows Store for Business takes on a different approach because it adds a layer of convenience to the organization. Now, what that means as an IT administrator is if I have specific applications that I would like to make available for my end users, I can actually take that application, upload it into the Windows Store, and make it available so that the Windows Store for my employee can actually see that application in the Windows Store as an additional application that they can actually install.
Right, and they have your own custom logoed store window that they access, and they can see those applications that you have published and made available to them. Another example of when we use Store for Business, and I have a customer that's actually doing this right now, is they have a grouping of users that need to use a DVD player. And the DVD player is $14.99 off the Windows Store as of today, and it's licensed. And $14.99 gives you a single license. So what the customer did was they bought a block of licenses from the store, and they gave access to specific users. So when those users launch the Windows Store from their Windows 10 desktops, they see this DVD player is available. They don't have to put their own credit card in to get the $14.99. The company's already done that. If I were to log in as one of those, as a different user, I would launch my Windows Store for Business and not have access to that because that DVD player has only been made available to certain users in the Store for Business. So it allows you to acquire blocks of licenses to be distributed, so those applications can be distributed to certain users.
Exactly. So, and then remember, there are two different roles. You can have a user or an IT professional. Those are two different roles that you have right now, and also just different scenarios by which you'd actually use the Windows Store for Business. One example would be offline distribution, where you're basically allowing access to that application even though it's offline, and then online distribution, make it available so when the user's connected to the network. Now, so Windows Store for Business is really just a much more innovative way of managing access to applications in one location. And they're working on ways to make it much more efficient so they can provide any application through that platform. You can still use SCCM, you can still use System Center Configuration Manager. It also has its own mechanism for allowing users to request access to an application. You can still use GPOs, where you can publish or assign an application to a user and have that application deployed to the system. And you can also use just the plain old batch script or actual installation of an application itself. The other place you'll be able to see this in is you can actually configure Windows Store apps. Now, this is again another setting on your device itself and allows you to basically do things like block the application, sideload the application, distribute them through the Windows Store, or even download the application. This just shows you a few of those options where you can actually see things like the size of that Windows application, what's installed in your machine, and the many other features that are available on that platform.
Yeah, if you look at my machine, I'm going to go to my Windows Store, and what's interesting is because I'm on a non-domain joined device, I'm on an Azure AD device, so I'm connected to my company's Azure AD. I have my own account here, and I have my work account here already linked. And so you can see I have my personal store. If I want to use my personal store to download anything, again, this is stuff that is mine. I would use my own credit card to download, or the stuff that my company has given me. And I can see my company's tab, and they are allowing me to get Translator or Bugger, which is a troubleshooting tool, or again, WinDebug or Microsoft Teams. So these are ones that Microsoft has made available to me that may be licensed, and they may even cost something, but they don't cost anything for me because it's part of the corporate store.
So as you can see there, it makes it easy really to just decide on what applications I want to install and from where they're coming from.
Yep.
As your organization matures, you can turn on Windows Store for Business and really deliver the core applications that you need for your business to be productive. The other side of this is you can actually see things like the size of space that's being used, where you want the application to be saved on your device, as well as anything related to just where you want to store offline content on your device as well. So here are a number of different ways where you can actually have files that are music placed in the music location, photos, etc. So these save locations are controllable as part of your Windows Store app configuration as well.
You can actually see, if you look at my screen, I just went to my settings and I typed in storage, and you can see everything that Alfred's talking about, where I have storage, my default save locations, right? So I have all this information available to me. Again, I'll just type storage, manage my storage space, everything that we're talking about in this video series that we can manage right from here in the Settings app.
The next piece of this that we want to cover is just using a PowerShell to basically do things like sideload store applications. So a sideloaded store application may be something that in your organization, your developer builds as a company-based application, and it becomes an AppX file. So they're using Visual Studio to build it, and at some point you want to make sure that application is available to be installed on the system. So these commands itself really just allow you to, what we call sideload it, into your operating system. So add AppX provision package, online folder path, you give it the path of the location of the file, and you can actually do the installation.
And the important thing there is, it is an AppX file that's being sideloaded. You're not sideloading MSIs and XEs and VBS types of applications. You're sideloading AppX files.
An AppX file is very similar to a packaged version of a universal Windows app. Right? And once it's installed, if you go to the Start window, you'll be able to find it and use it just like you do with one of those universal Windows apps. So we've given a couple other commands, how you could actually get the things, the package itself, the manifest itself. These are all ways of sideloading store applications that also can be uploaded to the Windows Store as well. The Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit, again, is the component that we can actually use to distribute the applications to the end users, and it's another tool that we use for deployment. And it also comes with different deployment tools like the Windows PE, the Image Configuration Designer, and the latest version is Windows ADK for Windows 10.
Now it's interesting that we bring this up here as a way to install applications as part of the imaging, but also we mentioned the ADK earlier in another series when we talk about preparing for Windows, installing Windows. We use the same ADK because, again, you can see the user state migration tools are there, and deployment tools and WinPE boot images and things like that are all available. But you can also use ADK for your application installations during the deployments.
We also mentioned earlier the MDT is another tool to deploy applications as well. It does the same. It does a better job of deploying OSs, but it also can be used to deploy applications.
Interesting about MDT 2013 Update 2 is it's called MDT, or Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2013. To my knowledge, they are never going to 2016, 2018, 2020. They're always going to call it MDT 2013 and maybe change the update revs as needed. Just like Windows 10 is not becoming Windows 11, Windows 12, Windows 15, it's always Windows 10, MDT will stay at 2013. Interestingly enough.
And we mentioned the Windows Configuration Designer. Again, another tool that you can actually use to provision packages. The packages are then installed on the machine, and you'll be able to run it based on the settings. Now, we covered this in earlier modules, but it's important that you guys know that this is an option. And then remote management. Now, remote management, again, goes back to how do I access the operating system or the machine that I'm running from a remote system. So we've covered, in this section, we cover basically some of the tools that you can actually use, from remote desktop to remote PowerShell, or even just using the MMC itself to kind of open up the console, the actual image and actually do work on the actual system itself. So different ways to access a Windows 10. The one we want to just mention specifically is the Remote Desktop Connection Manager for accessing systems remotely. We typically see this both in Azure as well as on-premise systems. As long as you know the IP address or the machine is is routable on the network, we can actually get to it.
What's interesting here is that we've been looking at this remote desktop connection to remote into our servers. We've been looking at this for 15 years, relatively unchanged. But how many of us have actually clicked the different tabs at the top of the box? Most of us only look at that general tab. We don't look at the rest of the remote desktop connection box. So we're going to show you the rest of that box. So, of course, the general tab allows you to put in the name of the machine you're connecting to if you want to save those settings. And then we have the display if you want to change your display
quality, the connection
DPIs.
bar, whether you want to use multiple monitors for the remote session, you can choose those options. And the third one you get is local resources. Do I want to connect my remote audio settings so that I can actually hear it on that remote system that I'm accessing?
One of the nice things there is printers, right? I'm at home and I VPN to my company, I remote into something and I want to print. I don't want it printing at work because I'm not at work. I want it printing at home. So I want to make sure that my printers follow through to that remote desktop connection.
And you can see that more button because that really gives you options that if you have other drive letters that you want to share, you can actually go in and share those drive letters remotely on that remote desktop setting. This allows you to copy files from one system to another. Now again, with the RDP, the 7, the latest client, you can actually just copy paste from your physical machine to the virtual or remote system without any problem because it does its own transfer of information automatically. And the other tab we look at is just to detect the experience itself. How strong of a connection am I making from this device to that remote system?
If I have an old dial-up connection, which I used to like to joke about, maybe I don't want a full performance to happen because it'll just take too long for all my mouse clicks.
And lastly, we have the advanced option where you can actually tell it to warn you or different settings around server authentication, whether it needs to give you additional information and prompt for access. That setting can be controlled here, and the option to connect from anywhere, which is basically configuring your settings to connect through some sort of remote desktop gateway, whatever that setting is on your remote desktop gateway.
For this exam, I would absolutely recommend opening up an MSTSC and going through all those different boxes, options, and actually looking at them, upgrading your RDP client if you have an older version of the client to get the best benefit, the security, even a better display resolution in the latest version of the RDP client than in previous versions.
And we have a practice question for you that we're going to go through with you right now. And if you are the administrator for Contosa.com, a user named Jane attempts to access a resource on a server 1 named Legal Docs, but is denied access. She then uses Remote Desktop to connect to server 1, opens File Explorer, and is able to access Legal Docs. You need to make sure when Jane attempts to access Legal Docs, she is denied access. All other users should not be affected by any changes you make. You connect to server 1 through computer management, expand share folders, click Legal Docs, and then click Properties. What should you do next?
So this is something we talked about earlier when we looked at our shared folder permissions. Shared permissions only take effect over the network, right? So A, on the Share Permission tab, add Jane's account and select Deny Read. B, on the Security tab, add Jane's account and select Deny Read. C, on the General tab, change the user limit to 0. And D, on the General tab, change the share name to Legal Docs $. Let's break down C and D first. So C, if you set the user limit to 0, Jane will absolutely be denied access on to the folder, but so will everybody else. So that can't be right. On the General tab, change the share name to Legal Docs $. That will actually unshare it, so everyone else will be affected and reshare it as a hidden share. That's the $sign at the end. So we know that it's A or B. A, on the Share Permission tab, add Jane's account and select Deny Read. She's already been denied read. She went to whack Legal Docs or Server 1 Legal Docs and was denied access. So she's already been denied read, either probably through a group that she's a member of. On the Security tab, add Jane's account and select Deny Read. So we know that B has to be the right answer, and we said that if you RDP into a server and then go and browse for the folder and have access to it when you shouldn't, it's because of the Security tab, not because of the Share tab.
Exactly. So thanks for going through that with us, Joe. It's very important to make sure that you know how to think about exam taking and how to eliminate the wrong answer so you can actually get to the right answer.
It's actually pretty funny because on this exam, when I sat to take this exam, I was surprised that, I know all these permissions, and I know I'm a member of multiple groups, and I have these permissions, and least restrictive, most restrictive. But you don't think about that until you're actually sitting in front of the exam, reading the question, and using your grease pencil and notepad to do the math to see what your permissions actually are.
It does take a lot of logical thinking and planning. So again, if you're not familiar with any of these terms that we mentioned, we are really challenging you to kind of step back, go back and do the homework on the section that we talked about that doesn't make sense or that you may have difficulty understanding, so that when you're in the exam room, you can still sort of comfortably walk through the process and find the answer you're looking for.
Exactly.
A few tips to remember as we're closing out this section module is refresh yourself on how to use subnets, supernets, and just common IPv6
And that was important too, because I remember back in the Windows 2000 days, we actually had an IP exam, which was all subnetting. And then the exam questions throughout the rest of 2003, 2008, 2012 had a couple of subnetting questions, and this has subnetting questions as well. We're going to give you a CIDR notation and make sure you understand what CIDR, CIDR means and how many IP addresses you have within that subnet.
The other thing to remember is just remember things like NetSH, PowerCFG, all these, ancient command prompt lines are still there. They still work. I wouldn't call them ancient, but they still are.
But I did.
They are
I wouldn't call them ancient, but I did call them ancient.
Ancient meaning that PowerShell is kind of taken over.
Right. They're old school.
Yeah, and they still work. They both still work, so they're still relevant. So if you see a question on there, sort of determine if there's another way to do it through PowerShell. And then lastly, just folder permissions, as Joe mentioned earlier. Make sure you know how allowing or denying access based on folder permissions, whether you need to share or unshare access using some sort of NTFS permissions. So with that, we wanted to make sure that we covered just some of those components. Primarily, this section, we talked about just Windows Store for Business, as well as accessing resources on the network. Again, thanks for joining us, and we hopefully this was helpful for you in preparing for the exam. In this module, we cover managing and maintaining Windows updates and the technology around the management of Windows 10. We really take a deep dive into things like Windows updates and making sure that your system remains up to date based on the latest version of Windows 10. Now, the servicing model is something that is very interesting, and we've done our best to sort of illustrate to you why that matters in this case, especially when you're taking the exam.
Right.
So we'll cover things like Windows update options, current branch for business, long-term servicing branch, and any requirements around rollback updates and Windows Store apps. How to go about updating your system and keeping it up to date.
Right, when we take a look at Windows updates, we're actually looking at two different updates with Windows 10. We're looking at the security updates that we're used to, those come on Patch Tuesdays, and then we're also looking at feature updates, and that's what's new with servicing that's coming out every 6 months or so. And we'll take a look at that in this section.
So what is Windows Update Options? What does it really give you, Joe?
So Windows Updates is giving you which updates do you want to deploy. One thing that's important to realize with Windows 10, and has actually been backported to Windows 7 now, but that's new to Windows 10, is instead of having Patch Tuesday that has 25 different updates or 20 different updates, and you can pick and choose which ones you want to install, you get one update now. So the benefit of that is we can take a machine that has been updated in months and months and apply a single update to it, and it's fully patched up to date. We don't have to apply them in special order and whatnot.
And we've listed out 4 different options for deploying Windows updates. The first being the default option, where you can just basically have some sort of online location for updating Windows depending on where you're located. The other is the Windows Update for Business, which allows you to do things like defer updates. And manage that deference, however, whatever works best for you.
You can create deployment rings for the updates, so a pilot ring of updates, all of that with Windows Update for Business. And as you said, you can defer the updates for a specified amount of time as well.
The third option is the WSUS, which is a Windows Servicing Update Services. And it allows you to administer, updates based on the requirements. You can integrate that with SCCM as well, or it can be a standalone solution. And lastly, the System Center Configuration Manager, which, as I just mentioned, is integrated with WSUS. At that point, you're managing updates to applications, managing updates to Windows 10, and any of the first services that you have.
Maybe even driver updates that are coming down automatically through Windows Update. And we mentioned the previous list about even Windows Store updates that might come down automatically.
No, so what's the difference between servicing updates and feature updates? And I hear that quite a bit.
So it's actually feature updates are the servicing updates. So it's feature updates versus the security updates. So this is, again, the security updates, those are going to come out as one large update, and they come down on Patch Tuesdays. Some of you may remember way back, depending on when you're watching this video series, in February of 2017, we actually we didn't do updates in February. And that was the first Patch Tuesday that had no updates available to it, because through our testing, And through our insider testing, we realized that because it's only one update instead of 25 individual updates where you pick and choose, there was an issue with one of the updates on some of the Windows 10 machines. So instead of putting that wild out to 400 million machines, knowing we had a problem with it, we didn't do any updates. So that's security updates in February, right? But they come out once a month.
So are those still called servicing updates, correct?
Well, they're security updates. They're the security in the critical updates.
Okay.
Servicing updates will be like when we went from version 15.11 to anniversary update 16.07 and to creators update 17.03, getting new features installed.
Okay, so from what I
So
remember...
there's servicing rings to deploy the feature updates. So as we're mixing terms here.
So maybe I'm thinking of feature upgrades, which
Right.
is...
So the feature upgrade is going from, again, from anniversary update to creators update. Would be a feature upgrade.
Okay. So and if I wanted to further control these updates, I can actually use the group policy settings to configure or delay the deployment of updates on my system. And in here I have a sample of where in the registry settings, or in the group policy settings, I can actually select when feature updates are received. And by delaying it using the current branch for business option, I then am taking advantage of the CBB version of Windows updates. It means I get a later version of the image.
So let's talk about a version that is coming out soon, and we call it Creators Update. Creators Update is scheduled to come out on April 11th. And when it gets released on April 11th, 2017, it will be what we call current branch. It'll be CB model. And what we can do to make sure that the machines are getting it, you can see I'm in my group policy editor. I'm on my local machine, but I could be in my domain controller doing it through group policy. If I go to Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Windows Update, I can control when updates are actually installed. Let me go down to Windows Update. I can control when they're installed, and you'll also see that I can control if I have to defer my updates, when my quality updates and feature updates are received, I can control that here. So I want to enable that, and I want to enable it for current branch or for current branch for business. My current branch machines are going to get it after 5 days of release, and my current branch for business are going to get it after 10 days of release or whatever I want to do, right? So I can have different policy settings set up for that this way. Now, so what will happen is, and we'll go back to April 11th when current branch is declared on Creators Update, roughly 4 months later, we'll look at our telemetry numbers and our feedback hub information and our service tickets and help desk calls and all that stuff, and we'll say, okay, there's enough machines running version 17.03 with all of their homegrown apps, with all of their ISV apps that aren't crashing, they're working flawlessly as expected. We're going to go ahead and declare this business ready, and now it's current branch for business. So when 17.03, about 4 months after its release, will be considered a current branch for business, and that's when these settings that you see on my screen would then start showing up. Once it's declared current branch for business, and I'm going to make up a date. I'll say it became current branch on April 11th, so we'll say August 15th, roughly 4 months later. Then 10 days after that, my current branch for business will start deploying on the machines that are still running 16.07.
So ultimately, it's the idea that you're delaying the actual deployment of the existing OS until it's actually tested by the testers.
By your testers, exactly. And that's where we come in with these servicing rings. So besides for the current, there's actually 4 servicing branches altogether, which I'll discuss. There's current branch and current branch for business. We've just discussed those. There's LTSB, which is the long-term servicing branch. Long-term servicing branch is its own SKU. I don't have anything here to show that because I'm not running on LTSB. It is its own enterprise SKU. And the last one is the Windows Insider Windows Insider program. Now with Windows Insider program, and you can see as I go into my settings app and I go to my Windows updates, I go to my Windows Insider program, because I'm already running Creators Update, when I say I'm all set to receive Insider Preview builds, my 2 choices here are receive Windows 10 Creators Update, which I already have. So my next one is pre-release operating systems. So the 4 branches, what we recommend is for your IT staff, they should be here. Windows Update, Windows Insider program is business ready as well. So your IT staff, they should be here, Windows Insider program. They should be getting whatever the latest releases of the operating system. And then some of your business testers, 8% of your company, something like that, running normal applications, they should be getting current branch updates. And then the rest of the 85, 90% of the company should be getting current branch for business over the next 12 months after that. And that can all be managed through SCCM, WSUS, through servicing branches.
So what if I wanted to look at my Windows updates on the machine that you're on now? How would I go about finding that information?
So that's a good question. So what you can do is, again, going back to your settings app and going back into your updates. I'm just going to go back to my home page. So update and security. I can go to Windows Update and I can look at my update history. And I can see which updates were installed and when they were installed. We're not supposed to show dates here, but I am right now to show you this history. So you can see when my latest release preview got installed on March 21st. And quality updates, driver updates that got installed previously as well. And I can uninstall them from here. I can even roll back, if I installed Creators Update, through my windows.old folder, I can roll back into an earlier version of Windows, which we'll talk about in a later series.
Excellent. Now that's good to know. And also on the current operating system, there's ways to see applications that are installed locally on the system itself. That is a new settings app location. So again, in the exam room, as you're preparing to look for things like update history, if they start asking you about finding the history settings, the updates for history, updates about what applications were installed, you might want to go into the settings app and then go into updates and then look at the history settings to find the detail.
Yep, so from my home page on my settings app, as Alfred was saying, it's right here. I can look at apps, where I can uninstall. You'll notice this is not what we're used to with add and remove programs, right? These are a lot of my apps, but not all of my apps. And I can still go to programs and features in the standard classic control panel, and I can see some other apps there. But I can do a lot of stuff from here. I'm not going to uninstall my feedback hub, but I can. So I can look at all my apps that are installed, and I can uninstall them from here, 3D Builder, and I can uninstall it if I so choose. Again, I like 3D Builder, and I'm not going to uninstall it. So I'm going to go back before I hit uninstall by mistake.
Excellent. No, that's good to know. And you mentioned something very interesting, which was the Windows as a service, just deploying Windows and just that whole cycle. And I was hoping that we could actually kind of dive into that a little further to understand what CB is, what CBB is, and how that fits into the whole model that Microsoft has.
Sure. What we can do is, and you can see in my cornucopia here, that we have the different branches available. And we mentioned that we have 4 different branches, and again, it's the Insider Preview branch, we have the Long-Term Servicing branch, plus the Current branch and Current branch for Business. So the way we do it here at Microsoft, we have the engineering builds that happen almost daily, and some people at Microsoft have signed up to receive daily updates. And then after that, when we decide that there's enough people getting it and it's working properly, and there's probably some issues that we're still working through, at Microsoft, we have the broader Microsoft internal, and there's tens of thousands of us running this version. So as an example here, I can tell you that version 1703, Creators Update, was available about 6 months ago. Even though it hasn't come out yet to the public, Microsoft insiders have been using it to tens of thousands for about 4 months, and before that even some other people. And then several million are in the Insider Preview build that you see here. I'm going to erase some of these other ones that you see there as well. So the Insider Preview branch, that's global Insider Preview branch. And again, we're installing 1703 and working through the feedback hub and any help desk tickets and telemetry to see if it's working properly. Then we'll call it April 11th, right? So it becomes declared as current branch or gets released. Then we tell you at your company, start installing it to some of your user base. Make sure the users that are going to give you honest feedback, they're going to run the applications the way they're meant to run, they can get this, this current branch version. From there, and again, so all of this should be those people that are going to be testing, but you don't want to give them to 10% of your company all at the same time, so we have it as preview rings or installation rings. These rings are available through WSUS, updates, and also through SCCM as basically as collections, but they are preview rings. And then about 4 months later, it becomes current branch for business, and it gets declared current branch for business. I'm going to again erase some of this stuff. You're going to love the pen. And over the next 12 months or so, you want to start rolling it out to the rest of your company during during however often you can do it as your project allows.
And that's good to know, and very helpful to kind of see it from a
Yep.
from a
And notice
diagram
what you don't
standpoint.
see there, though, is you don't see LTSB. Again, LTSB doesn't do those daily updates, doesn't do those monthly updates or those 6 months updates. There's nothing like that. With the idea with LTSB, the long-term servicing branch, is that you're going to install it and set it and forget it. You'll never look at it again for the next 10 years.
Excellent. No, and it's important to know the difference because in the exam they're looking for your understanding of each one of these different branches. Each branch has a specific purpose. One is much more aggressive, the latter is less aggressive. The LTSB, as we've mentioned a few times now, has less technologies, less features that are available, and maybe would only need to be run on specific types of hardware in your organization.
Yep, absolutely. LTSB, as you said, it doesn't have some of the features that are available everywhere else. Any new security features that came out since LTSB 2015 got installed into 2016, but anything after that won't get installed till the next LTSB version in about 3 years after that. And you can see that we have, when you would use each version, each different branch on different machines, you would use current branch. You want to target some of you, first of all consumer devices, right? If you have Windows 10 at home, you're getting current branch. Windows Update will start deploying this after April 11th. You're getting current branch. That's automatic. Unless somehow you went into your local group policy editor and deferred it, you're getting current branch if you're at home. So again, hundreds of millions of devices are going to get current branch update on April 11th.
Well, again, you still have the option to not necessarily say install current branch. It sits there. It can download. You can choose the option to start and download it and have it made available on your device. But until you actually accept it, it will not, overwrite your existing operating system. But it will be there.
Right. And for this exam, you really don't care about the home user. You care about the enterprise user. So at the enterprise user, current branch is, we talked about that. It's a small percentage of your company that are actually testing the applications. Current branch for business being the bulk of your company, 85 to 90% of the company, and long-term servicing branch, specialized systems. And we expect all companies will be using LTSB for some machines, but not for the bulk of their machines. Again, ATMs, operating room systems, and manufacturing machines.
Again, servicing updates is a huge portion of this section in the exam, and we've done our best to sort of list it out. We've even provided you information in terms of how long you can actually do the deferral. For example, you see 10 years here for the LTSB, 8 months, and then 4 months for current branch. Now, again, this is a variable thing in production. However, from an exam standpoint, you need to understand that CB has the shortest lifetime in terms of testing. CBB, you can have a longer delay period, and then LTSB, really, the replacement process takes a lot longer. If you're going from LTSB to CBB or CB, what's required?
So that's a good question. So let's say you're in a company or you have a question where they installed LTSB, but they actually like the servicing update model of using current branch for business. That is a SKU change. That's all you need to do is a SKU change to go from LTSB to current branch for business. Nice and easy, right? And then you reboot your machine, your current branch for business, and you move on. Now, I keep mentioning current branch for business. A machine isn't one or the other. It depends on what ring they're in for the update. Now, let's say on the other side, you are current branch for business and decided to go LTSB. That's not a SKU change. That actually is a wipe and load. You have to wipe out, not even in-place upgrade. That is a wipe and load. Get rid of the Windows 10 CBB and install the new LTSB SKU.
And again, the reason why is it sees it as a full different OS itself that needs to really just take on a new setting. So in order to sort of drive adoption of the model that supports updates, CB and CBB are the versions that you would want to consider, especially if you have a question that comes up on the exam around these technologies as well. The managing updates also will show you history information. If you went into the control panel and looked at the details, you'd actually see the updates that can be viewed or rolled back on your device. Here's a good example of where you can actually see what updates have been installed on a specific machine, and you can decide on using scripts or PowerShells like get hotfix to determine what's been installed in that machine. It'll list out all the hotfix that have been pushed down to your machine and which ones were installed, as well as which ones have failed at any point in time. Now, and the other part of this is we have updates to the store app. So if you need updates to the store app, you can actually go in here and choose the option to allow updates from the store app for specific updates. And so what happens now is you can actually, in the same network that you're in, decide on receiving updates from PCs in your specific location, or local network, or PCs in your local network and PCs on the internet. In other words, if it's not in your specific LAN, but it's available, it will then pull the bits down using bits throttling to your machine. So again, this is a configuration option you have. It may speed up the process of updating a specific store app, but it's available for you with Windows 10.
So that's a good point on getting your updates from another machine. It uses what we call like delivery optimization. And if you look at my Windows settings here, you can see from my main screen, I go to my updates, again, Windows Update, and then I can say in here, Advanced Options, choose how updates are installed. I want to get my Microsoft updates for other Microsoft products as well, right? This is actually set by my company, so I can't change that. And then choose how updates are delivered. Actually, before I even do that, pause updates. I want to temporarily pause updates on this machine for whatever reason up to 7 days. All right, so choose how updates are delivered. Get them from more than one place. I want to get them from PCs on my local network. I want to get them from PCs on my local network or PCs on the internet. So one PC on my local network has already gotten it from the Windows Store, and it can then deliver it down to my machine.
Excellent. And so the next section of this goes into monitoring Windows. And again, this goes back to how do I make sure that I'm maintaining the optimal performance for Windows 10, right? We've gone through the installation, we've talked about all the other steps, but monitoring Windows is also just as important to ensure that the performance you're expecting is there, so that you're managing printers, so that you're managing system resources.
Yep.
And also, one section we didn't mention is just the Feedback Hub, which we'll cover a little bit later, also helps find information that you need about your specific operating system itself. The update history and rollbacks updates, you can find it here. This is basically showing you where in your control panel where to find the updates. It takes you straight to Windows Updates, Advanced Options, and you'll see information around updates that can be installed individually or through the OS, and I think we mentioned this earlier.
Before you move on to that, where we say updates can be uninstalled individually or the OS can be rolled back, that OS can be rolled back for a period of time. Now, in older versions of Windows, that period of time was 30 days. So if you installed from 1507 to 1511 and it had an issue, you had 30 days that you could roll back to 1507. Now, that happens through the updates where it says roll back to previous version of Windows, but you can roll back as long as you have a windows.old folder on your C drive. So as long as this folder exists, this windows.old, you can roll back to your previous version of Windows. Now this windows.old folder is about 25 gig in size, at least on my machine it is. So actually, must have just deleted because it's been at least 10 days because it just showed as 933 meg, right? So it was about 25 gig in size. Nowadays, in the later version of Windows, it's only there for 10 days. Now, the reason it's there for 10 days is we realized through our telemetry and our Feedback Hub that nobody's actually rolling back later than that. They realize they have an issue in 5 or 6 days, they roll back within 10 days. No one waited the 30 days to roll back. So to hold 25 gigs of disk space hostage for 25 days or 30 days didn't make sense.
That was unfair.
Right. So now that windows.old folder, and it's a scheduled task that you could actually look at in your task scheduler, that windows.old folder gets cleaned up after 10 days now. Automatically, no user intervention, no one has to log on, log off, nothing like that. It just deletes itself after 10 days. But you can see, you look at your history, it showed, I think, events 1001 or 10,001 as one of the events you want to look for if you're having some issues.
Yeah, and that brings up a very good point, just Event Viewer itself. And subscribing to events, you can actually start to kind of track what updates, what changes are being made to the operating system. You can actually use these views and filters to find information. Yep. It helps you know exactly what's going on in your system. We have the option to subscribe or put in a subscription for, let's say, critical events and find that information as well.
Yeah, and it's not new to Windows 10, but it's something that we bring up here because it will be on your exam. It was available as early as Windows 7, maybe even Vista. But it's not something that was widely used, and it is something that definitely can help you. As you said, I can subscribe to, so my event viewer, I can see all of my errors, all my warnings, all my information. I can do a subscription that only looks for critical errors.
Task Manager is also a very handy or very useful tool on your Windows 10 system. It has been basically updated to really take on a much more broader approach at finding information. CPU, memory, disk, any details around the device, you'll be able to kind of identify what's going on, what resources are being used, and determine if there's a way you can actually go about optimizing your operating system. You'll see a button here at the bottom that's showing Open Resource Management.
Yep. So if you look at my Task Manager that I have open right now, it's the default view of Task Manager when you first open it is nothing, and people are like, what am I supposed to do with this? So you click the more details, and then if you look at the Performance tab, where we can see the CPU and the memory being used right now in my system, I can then open up Resource Monitor. Now, to me, that's the easiest way to open Resource Monitor. You can also get there through browsing or asking Cortana to open it, but I go to Task Manager first. And from Resource Monitor, I can see a lot of that same information, but I can actually see it broken down with a lot more information embedded about each of my subsystems. So again, here's Resource Monitor, and again, I can look at my memory.
So how's it different from Task Manager?
So again, Task Manager will give us some information. I can see CPU as an example, and I can see some counters in here, but I don't see a lot of counters. But through my Resource Monitor, I can actually get pretty granular as to what I'm looking at about my CPU. Look at all these counters. Look at all these counters I have for CPU. I mean, that's a lot of stuff to look at for CPU, right? That Task Manager just doesn't offer me.
Excellent, excellent. No, that's good to see. And then again, on the exam, as you're walking through this, you might run into the scenario they're asking you about the difference between Resource Manager,
Resource Monitor.
Yeah, Resource Monitor, not Resource Manager. You'll get it wrong if you choose Resource Manager. The Task Manager and Resource Monitor, which are two different solutions, and also the Performance Monitor. So these are all different tools that you can use to find performance numbers or metrics on your device. So know the difference between the two. Also know how to use tools like the Performance Monitor. Again, Performance Monitor, really all it's doing is basically giving you real-time or log performance data based on a period of time. You can collect event trace data and systems configuration data and analyze that to see if at a point in time there were issues on your system in terms of performance.
Right, data collector sets as well, so you can get groupings of data that all get reported at the same time. It can be scheduled to collect the data collector set, so
exactly.
Yeah, all through Performance Monitor.
And then lastly, we have Windows Defender, which is again, built into the operating system and allows you to have real-time protection. We've shown you just some of the PowerShell commands that can actually use to pull information around whether you have threats on the device, whether the things that you need to do to scan it. These commands are definitely something that you should be prepared for to see on the exam. And also the settings app itself, the fact that we've integrated that into being able to see how Windows Defender has been configured, what drive letters are being blocked, and how it's being used.
So Windows Defender, a lot of us have been looking at Windows Defender, not loving Windows Defender since the early Windows days, maybe Windows, 7, Vista, I get right? But it was rewritten for Windows 10, and it's a great antivirus or endpoint protection product in Windows 10.
Exactly. And then lastly, the cloud-based protection. The idea that you can actually get it for real-time protection when Windows Defender sends that data to the cloud itself and allows you to analyze and see if there are any issues on the device. So with that, I think the important thing to remember is that this section really covers around ways to manage and maintain your operating system, ways to identify if there are threats, ways to manage a history to see if there are any issues going on, and just manage event logs. Again, this is a portion exam, so we're expecting you to prepare for it. Hopefully what we've covered is helpful for you, and we hope to see you in the next section. In this section, we learn about configuring systems and data recovery on Windows 10 and understanding the components that really make up what is required to set up a data solution for Windows 10. We'll cover things like recovery drives, system restore, driver rollbacks, as well as using Device Manager, as well as OneDrive as a recovery option. We'll also talk about Windows Backup Admin and Windows Recovery. So there are a lot of different options you have when you're thinking about just data recovery on a Windows 10. And there are different ways you want to think about it. In this exam, this section, again, because the questions may not be ordered one by one, you need to be familiar with all of these different methods in case that question comes up on the exam. Now, there is more than one way to think about it. If I need to back up data on the local machine, what tools am I using to do it? Is it built into Windows, or is it an external tool that allows me to do that as well? Now, we have what we call the recovery drive. A recovery drive, in essence, is a USB media that can be used to basically troubleshoot or fix an issue against a Windows 10 system that won't start. We don't want to confuse this with, like a partition on a hard drive. This is actually an external recovery drive that can be used for, backing up your system
Yeah,
data.
exactly. You create a recovery drive by putting a USB in there. It backs up your system files to the USB drive, and you can boot up to that. And again, it's to find out what happened and to hopefully recover from that lost Windows installation.
Exactly. So think about recovery drives as a quick way to back up your system. And a lot of times, if you're looking at options and you're working with an enterprise, or give you a scenario from a business perspective, this is one of those options that may be the quickest way to get the system back up and running. It may not be associated with the drive, recovering drivers, but it might be associated with getting the system back up and running fairly quickly. The other tool that you might want to think about using is the system restore tool, where you're being asked to do a system restore to a certain point. And this is typically something that gets configured on your device. You have to enable system restore, and then allow you to do things like driver rollbacks and as well as refresh of the PC itself.
Right. One thing when you reset this PC, and we talked in another video series about provisioning packages, and one of the nice things about reset this PC is it allows you to reset the PC back to the way it was factory. So not your custom employer's image, so not your corporate image, but back the way it was at factory, and then use a provisioning package to put it back to the way you want it managed, the way you want it to look. So reset this PC does not give you the option of doing a custom image. It's always back to factory, and that's why doing something like a provisioning package really helps in that.
And the third option is a data recovery tool. Now, a data recovery tool, again, is something that allows you to restore information that's been removed or lost in your system. So we have file history that's built into Windows 10. And if you've configured it correctly, you can use locations like the library, the desktop, the contacts, and favorites, and have that information copied to a specific file location. And then file history allows you to revert back to an older version of a specific document that may have been backed up on a separate drive. And now, the other tools that are available are also OneDrive. We can use backup and restore.
So one interesting tidbit about OneDrive that a lot of people don't realize is there's a recycle bin in OneDrive. So if you delete something in OneDrive, you can get it back by going to the recycle bin. Whereas formerly, OneDrive, you deleted it, it was gone, right? So now there's a recycle bin, and you can recover your data, your deleted OneDrive data right from that recycle bin.
The next section goes into configuring an authorization and authentication. So this goes back to, how do I ensure that I'm logging onto the system securely? How am I making sure that I'm in the right network, on the right home group or any sort of settings? And what am I using for my Microsoft account? Now, although it has a lot of content in it in that section, it really just is intended to make sure that you understand the identity aspects of Windows 10. What is Microsoft Passport? What is Credential Guard? What is Device Guard? Now, we've spoken about this in several sections in the past, but the important thing to remember that each one of these are something that you will be tested on in the exam.
In the long and short of that big list is that passwords are bad, biometrics are good, right? Anyone can look over your shoulder and watch your password, or go onto your social media and guess what your password is, your dog's name, your kid's name, your birthday, but they can't use your finger or your face to log into a system, right? Passwords are bad, biometrics are good.
If you ever used Windows Hello, it also gives you options to do things like improved recognition. In Windows Hello, although it seems as it's a very simple technology, it takes your information and literally hides your password or stores your password in a safe location using Microsoft Passport. And
so, yeah, you can see here on my screen that I have my Windows Settings app open. I'm just going to type in hello, because I always, as you know by now, I always type, I never actually browse. And I can set my face recognition or my fingerprint, and that's because I happen to be using my Surface Pro 4 device with a fingerprint scanner. If I don't have a scanner, that option is not available. If you can't see Alfred's face, he's amazed that I have a fingerprint scanner on my device.
That's kind of cool.
I
knew they were there.
And it has my face recognition. So as I click on set up face recognition, it brings me to that same location where I can improve my face recognition, or I can remove my face recognition. Now, why would I remove it? Or why would I improve it? One thing you notice you can't do is you can't add an additional one. So I can't say, okay, you can log in as me. Why don't you put your face there too? And if I go to improve it with your face, it's going to basically, I don't know what happens with my face as far as that's all concerned. It just depends on the numbers that you have. Right? So I can improve my facial recognition. So if I have my sunglasses on, if I have a headset on, so I look a little bit different, it'll also catch me that way. And again, I can add another fingerprint. I've actually only done one finger. So if something happens to that finger, I'm going to have to register a new fingerprint at that point. So I may want to go ahead and add another fingerprint and get started and make sure it's you, enter my PIN, which is important to note that it always wants to make sure that the person doing this is the person that's logged in. Okay, touch the finger sensor. Great, touch it again. And I'm not going to go through it. You have to do it 10 times. I'm not going to do that in this demo. But I would do that 10 times. If at some point it can't recognize my fingerprint because it's off to the side, it'll say, oh, touch it again. Can't figure it out, touch it again, right? It's not actually saying great or success. Oh, that one did, although that was just my tip. Oh, having trouble recognizing you, right? So it wants to make sure that it got it right. It's not just going to accept anything as you touch it there.
So for the exam, what do we need to know about fingerprint toucher?
So what you should know is that with Windows Hello, you can use a face or you can use a fingerprint. You can use even other biometrics as long as you have other scanners, an iris scan or something like that, third-party tool, or your computer can support it. And that if you register a face, an actual human face, a picture of your face won't work to unlock it. If you register a picture, a human face actually won't work to unlock it. It has to be 3D, 3D, or 2D, 2D, right? So I register my face, only my face can unlock that device. And a new feature in later versions of Windows that's coming out with the Creators Update, or if you've watched this sometime in the future, it came out with Creators Update, is Dynamic Lock. And what Dynamic Lock does when combined with Windows Hello, I'm just going to go to Dynamic Lock. No results for Dynamic Lock. Can you believe that? I'm going to go back to my accounts. I have to browse for it.
And we're giving you a little tidbit. Even though it's not an exam, it's nice to know what Dynamic Lock is.
Dynamic Lock may make it to an exam. It's not on the exam today. It probably, during updates, it probably will end up on an exam. I have no reason to believe that it won't be. So what Dynamic Lock does is it allows me to pair my Bluetooth phone to my device. And again, you don't need UAC. You don't need to be an administrator to do that Bluetooth pairing. So it allows you to pair your device. And when you walk away to go get a cup of coffee or to go grab a phone call or go to the restroom, as long as you have your phone with you, your device will automatically lock when it falls out of Bluetooth range. So that's a really nice feature because a lot of us do get up and go get a cup of coffee without hitting Windows L or without logging off or locking our system. This will automatically lock your system for you as you walk out of Bluetooth range.
That's pretty nice.
And then as you sit down in front of your computer when you come back, either your face or your fingerprint will automatically unlock you. Again, never enter a PIN, never enter a password.
So this is tied into the whole, authentication,
Exactly.
access, and protecting the user information on the device itself. The other area that we kind of focus on as well is the work group, the domain home group, and the Azure AD join options that you have on a Windows 10 device. Now, there are several options for adding a device to a domain. We have the ability to install a new Windows 10 image, and the very first time you install the image, it actually is added to its own local work group, meaning it's not part of an enterprise, it's not part of Azure AD, and you really can do just the same amount of work, except you're not going to be managed through group policy or any settings that you would see in an enterprise structure. The other option is you can have a domain joined, which is if you have an on-prem Active Directory environment, you can actually join your machine to that domain so that it can be recognized and utilized to access resources within that domain. It can also be managed through group policy or any other domain-specific settings that I can push down on that device. And lastly, you can also use Azure AD Join, which is basically taking the device and joining it to an Azure AD subscription that you or your company has subscribed to, allowing you to manage that device in the cloud as well, and be able to access resources that are available in that cloud infrastructure.
Now, what's interesting and what you should know is you can't be work group joined and domain joined. You're one or the other. You can't be domain joined or Azure AD joined. Again, it's one or the other. And you can see from my system, and I mentioned on one of the other video series, that I am Azure AD joined. And you can see that if I go to my accounts from my settings app. You can see access work or school. I am currently connected to my Microsoft Azure AD. Now, what that means is I'm getting whatever MDM we use Intune, whatever MDM policies are coming down to my machine, I'm being managed that way, not through group policy, through the standard group policy. So there are still things like my Windows Update settings and other settings that I can't change because my organization is managing those, but it's managing it through our MDM solution, not through group policy.
The other side of that is you also have the opportunity to do what we call device registration. And device registration allows you to connect a device to a specific domain. And if you're using Azure AD Join, you can do that. It's going to be registered in Azure AD. You can, if you're doing domain join, it's going to be registered to your on-premise Active Directory. But ultimately, there's an object grid that's associated with any device that's joined to a managed domain, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem. You have the ability to do what we call device write back, which takes the information in Azure AD about that device that you registered with Azure AD and write it back to your on-prem infrastructure. And that allows you to use things like conditional access to access resources that are available for you in the on-premise network. You can also utilize that in the scenario where you're taking advantage of what we call single sign-on for specific web applications, because now it recognizes you as a user on a device that's supported and managed in the infrastructure as well. But you'll also need a web application proxy, you'll also need a DNS record, and you also need some level of Active Directory Federation services running to be able to take advantage of those opportunities for single sign-on.
Shameless plug, for information on those, visit our exam prep series on exam 70742, which is Server 2016. Shameless plug.
Microsoft accounts as well are something of interest in the platform. Now, there is a core difference as a Microsoft employee. When we hear the word Microsoft account, it gets kind of confusing because technically we all have Microsoft accounts. So we have to make a distinction. We call them corporate accounts. Corporate accounts are accounts that are identified with your organization. Ours happens to be the @Microsoft.com infrastructure. A Microsoft account, in terms of this exam, is referring to an account that has been registered within the Microsoft set of registered domains. Hotmail, Live, Outlook, MSN, any one of those, or even a Gmail account.
Yeah, even your Gmail accounts, your Yahoo Mail, those can all be considered Microsoft accounts or MSAs.
And the idea is that Microsoft itself, in using it for providing you access to applications that are either on-prem or in the cloud, it will automatically identify that user account based on the access rights and permissions that have been given to that account. And the Microsoft account is what basically controls that access. Now we can also then use that to synchronize settings across multiple machines. So if I'm Tom at hotmail.com on PC A and Tom at Microsoft hotmail.com on PCB, I can have those settings so that regardless of whether they log on to PC A or PCB, Tom's settings are allowed to roam between those two settings.
Yep, and you can see on my screen where I have my settings app up, and I went into my settings and then my accounts. You can see I have my MSA is my live.com account. And if you come down further down here to sync my settings, wherever I happen to log in a Windows 10 machine, and I log in as that same MSA, which is my @live.com account, all of these settings that I have set up will roam. And since I'm not using ease of access, it's something that I could, if I wanted to, I could turn that off. Individually turn off ease of access or Internet Explorer settings, whatnot. But sync my settings between the devices that I use every day. So any settings I set, I don't have to reset on the other device.
And this is important if you get a question in an exam that's asking you to understand, how do I keep my data synchronized amongst a number of different environments or systems? You might want to make sure that the user has enabled their Microsoft account and then allows them to sort of use the sync settings across a number of systems. Configuring advanced management tools are also important, and this goes back to making sure that you know how to use the device manager and how to use Task Scheduler and a number of other tools that allow you to automate configurations on Windows 10. In this section, we talk about services, device manager, Task Scheduler, Windows PowerShell, and understanding what those services can provide you on any machine. Now again, keep in mind, these settings are also on Windows Server, but primarily for this exam, they want to make sure that you understand how you can control these settings using PowerShell and how you can access them in the Service Manager tool itself.
And you should note, and you can just see from the screenshot, that we have up there that you can set different logon properties or recovery properties on each service. If a service doesn't start, take a look at that logon, see who it's supposed to be logging on as, if it's set to a user account, specific account, or even a system account. So look at these services. Again, this is no different than what we've been doing with server forever, but it's something that's tested in this exam as well. And especially, as Alfred said, the stop service, get service, set service, PowerShell commands.
So you can all control this through some sort of remote action to control, what settings are turned on and which ones aren't.
Yep.
In addition to that, we also have what we call the task scheduler. Now, task scheduler is nothing new to the Windows platform. It's just been enhanced, improved, and it has a much more refined look. And once you get into the task scheduler, what you're able to do is see things like user-defined or specific system tasks, and you can have things that trigger that action to run a scheduled backup, to run access to a specific update. You can do a cleanup of the device. So anything you want to put into a batch script.
You can see on my screen, I'm going to open my task schedule again by typing, so schedule tasks. And I'm going to open up my control panel schedule tasks, and here's my library. Microsoft, and we'll just say Windows. And these all have predefined, I didn't set up hundreds of tasks. These are predefined tasks that have been set up for us. And you go down to Windows Update as an example. And I can see what schedule start, or, I look at reboot or multiple automatic app updates. So open up any one of these to see what triggers it. Look at the actions or the conditions and take a look. And if I want to keep a history of this, which is disabled on this one, I can enable my history so I can know when the last time this ran successfully. And again, hundreds of tasks predefined, and of course I can always create new tasks as well. Go ahead.
The task automation with Windows PowerShell also gives you the ability to run task jobs. So if you wanted to do a new job trigger, if you wanted to do a register a scheduled job, you can actually find that file and actually run that to automate just the process of running a specific task. PowerShell is very important in this exam, and probably you'll hear us say it over and over again. Make sure you understand how to do many of these functions in PowerShell, because they will test you on whether or not you understand the PowerShell language.
Absolutely. And the way you'll see this on this exam is you'll see a portion of a query on one side and a whole lot of verbs and actions on the other side that you have to click and drag into the right location within that query to make it correct. And there's no partial credit. You get the whole query correct, you get the whole query incorrect.
One other thing I want to show you about the Feedback Hub is pretty cool. Joe, can you show us what that looks like today?
Oh, absolutely. So you can see I typed in Feedback Hub, and here's my Feedback Hub, and it's tied to my Microsoft account. And I can say I'm having trouble with Microsoft Edge. I can start typing in Edge, and it's going to give me some feedback that other people have given on Edge. And I can then say upvote, yes, I'm having that issue as well. Or nope, nothing there actually is what's going to help me out. And obviously I would look at more than just the top one. And I can then add new feedback. Edge crashed on me, whatever that feedback happens to be. Is it a suggestion or a problem? That's a problem. And it goes right up to Microsoft. And it actually goes to the right people at Microsoft. The Feedback Hub gets tens of thousands of bits of data every month based on your feedback. And sometimes it's the little smiley face that you see in the top corner of apps, and sometimes it's through the Feedback Hub. So again, give us more detail here, and by giving more detail, you can actually, here's the Edge crashed, and then I can say something like, when I went to a specific site, right? So you type in whatever the specific site is, Edge crashed, and then what category, again, so we know exactly at Microsoft who's supposed to receive this feedback. So give as much detail as possible in the Feedback Hub.
And one other thing we want to show is also just the recycle bin itself, and being able to see data that's in your recycle bin on the OneDrive. If you ever delete a file on your OneDrive, there's an option to go back and recover data in the OneDrive, and it's just right here. Nothing majorly crazy about it, but it is available. It's available for about 30 days. If you delete something, you can just recover it using the recycle bin. So I think I like this because now I have not just one way to recover information, but multiple ways to pull my information back.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said before, that recycle bin is a feature that's been there in OneDrive for several months, maybe a year or more. And most of us don't realize it's there. We delete something in OneDrive, we go, oh, can't believe I deleted it. But you can get it back again from the recycle bin.
Exactly.
And as you said, for a period of time, it's not there forever. right? Like your Windows recycle bin is.
And we'll go over a practice question with you. You are the help desk technician for Contosa.com. A user connects to her desktop each evening from home to run some reports. The user calls you to tell you that recently the report seems to be taking a long time to run. You decide to schedule the collection of the relevant performance data. Which tool below allows you to schedule the capturing of performance data?
Right, and we took a look at all of these: Resource Monitor, Task Manager. We talked about Performance Monitor, Event Viewer, and Data Collector Sets. So again, breaking this down, what I like to do with something like this is I make all 5 of these as true false. Is it Resource Monitor? False, because that shows me in real time. Is it Task Manager? False, it shows me in real time. Performance Monitor, I can schedule some things. I think I can look at it in real time. I'm going to put a question mark next to that. Data collector sets, I know can allow me to schedule collections of specific pieces of data. And Event Viewer is just logs of errors and issues
You
and
can
warnings.
see over time what you want to change, but it doesn't give you
Right, it's not going to allow
collection
me
set.
to schedule a collection of data. So in this case, the answer is D, data collector sets. But again, as I'm breaking a question like this down, and some of you may think that was an easy question anyway, but as I'm breaking this down, I actually look at all 5 of those choices as true, false, and I put in my little grease pencil, grease board, false, 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 true, false, and then I mark it correct.
And again, the last portion of this is to make sure that you understand what tips to think about. We've talked about everything around backups and recovery. The primary place that you want to think about, beefing up your understanding, tip number 1, is to use the task manager. So all the different recovery options between file level, OS level, understand each one of those and how to restore your data back to the system itself. And tip number 2, make sure that you know that you can actually roll back to a specific update if needed to. And so that works too. And watch for any of the required end results as you're going through the process. And tip number 3 is that know your tools: Performance Monitor, Resource Monitor, Task Manager. Know exactly which one is best for what function that you're trying to perform. And that way you'll do just a much better job at making sure you get through this exam without any problem.
Yep, I agree.
So this section really was important because now you have a better understanding of how to deal with backup recovery as well as maintenance. Anything that allows you to restore your data if for some reason you lose information. It's the last portion of the exam, but really hoping that you can take that and make that of value for you when you take the exam. Once again, thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed the session.